You dare stand before me? Kneel or be cut down where you stand! My crown! The throne!
The dungeon smelled the way it always did at 4 in the morning. Damp stone and old iron and the residue of someone else's ambition. I finished oiling the last set of bracers, set them by Ethan's bedroll, and wrote the weight in my ledger. Nobody asked me to keep a ledger. I kept one anyway. That was the job. Not because anyone noticed, but because it was the kind of thing that mattered exactly when it stopped getting done. The campfire popped. I looked up. Ethan, the Holy Knight Mira, the heavy fighter Grant, all wrapped in expensive fur blankets, breathing the easy sleep of people who believed they were invincible. Their faces looked almost noble in the firelight, beautiful in a way, as long as I stayed awake for another 3 hours to make it true. I turned back to the work. Ethan's holy sword had 6 fresh chips in the edge, all from today. He swung it like a club. I pulled a whetstone from my infinite storage and worked the blade in silence, stroke by stroke. The faint scraping vanished into the dark. My hands were black with oil, 3 days of grime under the nails. Next came the potions. They did not come pre-bottled. I bought the recovery fluid in bulk barrels and transferred it vial by vial into combat-ready glass bottles, each one sealed airtight against oxidation. Skip this step, and someone dies in the boss fight. They did not know that. They thought potions appeared the way bread appeared. Somebody else's problem until the shelf was empty. I had not slept in a week. S-rank party, Sword of Dawn, sung about by bards, painted on recruitment posters across the continent. Behind all of it, the accounting, the equipment maintenance, the contract negotiations, the supply runs, was me. My title was Porter. What I actually carried was the party's entire survival margin, and tonight I could feel it ending. The way Ethan looked at me had changed. The tolerance was gone. What replaced it was the contempt reserved for furniture you have decided to throw away. A blanket rustled. Ethan sat up, golden hair catching the firelight, and yawned. He picked up the water flask and drank. The water inside was clean because I had boiled and filtered it the night before. He did not notice. He told me to leave after this dungeon. The word he used was babysitting. The whole party was sick of it, he said. Grant had complained I made the group nervous. He wanted my 20% of the reward redirected toward hiring a real mage. My storage skill, he said, could be replaced by a big bag. My hand froze on the whetstone. 20%. I had negotiated the inn discounts, filed the taxes, bribed the guild clerks, calculated potion costs to the copper, managed every rental contract under my personal name. The 20% he begrudged was half what the workload deserved. I had swallowed the difference on a childhood friendship that, looking at his eyes now, no longer existed. Nothing. He said I did nothing. The heat in my chest cooled so fast it felt like a valve closing. Not anger, something quieter. Finality. Understood. I will leave now. His face went slack. He had planned for tomorrow morning, not this second. He told me to wait, that I would die alone out there at night. I will manage. I sheathed his freshly sharpened sword and placed it at his feet. Worry about your own breakfast. He laughed and slapped the leather satchel on his hip. The magic bag I had bought him. He did not know its capacity was less than 1% of my infinite storage. He did not know that anything stored inside it rotted over time. I gathered my things. One belt pouch, the clothes on my back, everything that mattered, the guild seal, the contracts, the ledger copies, the spare potions, the replacement weapon sets, lived in my dimensional storage under my personal name. They had delegated full authority to me years ago because paperwork bored them. That delegation made ownership clear. I walked into the dark. Behind me, Ethan told me to go farm turnips, said it suited me better. I did not turn around. If I had, I might have felt sorry for him. The dead end looked like a wall. I pressed a hidden brick and a cavity opened, an emergency shelter I had prepared 6 months ago, the day I first concluded this arrangement would end badly. I lit a lantern and pulled a portable stove and a pouch of fresh ground coffee from storage. Yesterday, at this hour, I would have been cooking for 3 people, dragging Ethan out of his blankets, massaging the stiffness from Grant's shoulders. Now, I only needed to brew 1 cup. The first sip pulled something loose in my chest. Not relief exactly, more like the sound a chain makes when the last link breaks. I took out the 2-way communication stone and pushed magic into it. The merchant guildmaster picked up half asleep. "It is Leo. I left the party. Freeze all contracts tied to Sword of Dawn. Effective now." Something crashed on the other end. He asked if I was serious. I cited the clause. Without the account holder's signature, all agreements dissolve automatically. He knew the party's credit was worthless without me. He agreed in under a minute. Activate the rental equipment recall. Deadline is noon today. Confirmed. He added that business would be simpler with me freelance and suggested a drink when I surfaced. I leaned against the wall. Somewhere deep in the rock, a vibration traveled through stone. They were moving toward the boss floor. Noon. The mithril armor, the fireproof cloaks, every piece of high-end gear on their bodies. I had personally negotiated the rental lease, and my magical signature was required for the monthly renewal. Deadline, noon today. Without renewal, the forced recovery enchantment would trigger. Equipment locks, then disassembles, then transports back to the guild. They would be face to face with the Hydra when it happened. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and began drafting incorporation papers for my own company. I was not there for this part, but the guild report crossed my desk 3 days later, and the surviving witnesses told anyone who would listen. They had woken to spoiled rations and fouled water. The dried meat was stone hard. The water had gone green. Without me purifying it nightly, everything in Ethan's cheap satchel had rotted. They were hungry, sluggish, and arguing before they reached the first corridor. Ethan's sword bounced off a skeleton's ribcage. The edge had degraded overnight, rust forming on the steel. Grant moved like he was dragging anchors. Mud caked into every armor joint. Mira exhausted half her magic on trash enemies that should have cost nothing. By the time they reached the boss chamber, they were underfed, half depleted, and running on ego. The Hydra waited. 3 heads, purple toxin coiling around its body, 6 eyes burning in the dark. Ethan charged. He trusted the mithril plate to stop everything. Mid-air, a red warning window materialized from his chest plate. Rental contract expired. Account holder absent. Forced recovery initiated. Every joint in his armor seized. He dropped like a steel coffin into the Hydra's shadow, arms locked above his head, sword frozen in a swing he could not finish. Mira's anti-magic cloak went dead. Nothing but heavy cloth. Grant's tower shield dissolved into particles and transferred itself back to the Merchant Guild warehouse, leaving his hands gripping empty air. They survived, barely, crawled out with nothing. No equipment, no credit, and breach of contract penalties compounding by the hour. Weeks turned to months. Every sponsor dropped them. Every agency closed its books. The debt grew. I heard the details over my second cup of coffee, writing the final line of the Leonardo Trading Company Incorporation charter. Months passed. The company grew the way things grow when nobody is wasting your time telling you how to do what you already know. The concept was simple. I linked multiple dimensional storage spaces into a networked infrastructure and offered a flat rate subscription. Any contracted adventurer could pull what they needed when they needed it. No spoilage, no guesswork. The system I had run for Ethan's party, stripped of sentiment and scaled across every guild in the capital. The office took the top floor of a building on the main avenue. Thick carpet, wall of windows. The city spread below. Sylvia, former Ice Witch, current secretary, the most competent person I had ever worked with, placed a cup of first flush tea on my desk without a sound. "The guild partnership is finalized," she said. "Exclusive supply rights across all registered dungeons. Effective immediately." I sipped the tea. Young fragrance, floral, not bad. "The royal household cannot afford this blend. Their budget barely covers hot water." She nodded. Completely serious. Confirmed. Peace. The kind I had forgotten existed. I could choose my tea, my chair, the people in the room. For the first time in years, the only schedule that mattered was mine. That was the morning Ethan found me. The shouting came from the entrance. A man in destroyed leather armor was yelling at the waiter about being a hero and demanding to eat on credit. I knew the voice before I saw the face. Ethan, beard wild and unkempt, gold hair matted, dulled to straw. Behind him, Mira, with vacant eyes, her saint's vestments caked with grime, and Grant, his massive frame withered to something half-remembered. A few months ago, they had been on recruitment posters. Now they could not talk their way past a cafe hostess. He saw me. The stench arrived first, the unwashed animal smell of weeks without a bath. He charged toward my table, shouting my name, demanding to know how I was living like this while his life was ruined. He lunged for my collar. Security had him on the ground before his fingers touched fabric. Pinned to the tile, he screamed that everything was my fault, that I had sabotaged the recall, that I was a traitor. The contract specified automatic termination in the absence of the account holder, I said. You signed it. Did you read the terms? He had never read anything I put in front of him. Not once in all those years. I took a parchment from Sylvia. I have something for you. His eyes went bright. He thought it was money. An invoice. I dropped it in front of his face. 15 billion gold. Replacement cost for the National Treasure Grade mithril equipment your party destroyed, plus breach penalties, plus months of compound interest. The Merchant Guild has appointed me as the collection agent. The color drained from his face like water through a crack. I told him the rest. His family estate, Mira's church donation accounts, Grant's family forge, all secured as collateral, all scheduled for public auction. The legal paperwork had been finalized the day before. The man who once called himself a hero crawled to my shoes. He pressed his forehead to the leather until the skin split and bled. He apologized. He begged me to come back, said the party could not function without me, said we were childhood friends. I crouched beside his ear. I am a merchant. I do not make trades that lose money. And you, Ethan, are a terrible return on investment. Security dragged him away. His screaming thinned into the street noise. The other patrons murmured about fallen heroes, shrugged, and returned to their pastries. I stood, adjusted my cuffs. Let us go, I said. The guildmaster is waiting. Yes, President, Sylvia said. The black sediment in my chest, the thing that had sat there since the dungeon, was gone, not revenge. Inventory clearance. The books were clean. The kingdom was dying from the edges in. I did not witness what happened at Galatia personally. The captain's report reached my desk 2 weeks later, and it read like a man who had stopped believing in the country he served. For 3 days, the garrison had survived on mud-colored soup and black bread, hard enough to chip teeth. The preservation enchanted containers my company once supplied had been replaced by plain wooden crates. Half the food rotted in transit. Soldiers who ate it went down with cramps. Those who did not ate nothing. Their weapons had rusted. No oil, no maintenance kits. The captain wrote that drawing his own sword felt like pulling a nail from wet wood. Baron Victor commanded the fortress. He stayed behind a locked door while his captain prepared 500 half-starved men to face 3,000 orc heavy infantry. Victor was the reason I had been expelled from the kingdom's logistics contracts. My network had threatened the procurement deals he controlled, and he had the political weight to push me out. The men behind those walls were paying for his ego with their bodies. The orcs hit. The garrison held 2 hours on desperation alone. The captain's final line stayed with me. He wrote that the only thing he wanted when the wall was breached was a warm cup of coffee. Victor fled through a service tunnel before the fortress fell. The defeat report reached the capital the same week a knight kicked open my office door. The knight did not knock. He tracked mud across my carpet and slammed a red-sealed conscription order onto my desk. Sylvia moved to intercept. He shoved past her. I activated a spatial lock card, and his arm froze in midair. "Touch my secretary," I said, "and you leave this building missing something." He announced the terms. Immediate deployment as a frontline supply officer. All company inventory seized for the crown. No compensation. He called it a sacred duty. I read the order. The legal basis was thinner than the parchment. One question. The kingdom has outstanding invoices with my company. Will those be settled before the seizure or after? He had nothing. Come back with an answer. Then I stopped. A collapsing country is a buyer's market. The land was worthless. The authority was not. On second thought, I will come, not as a conscript, as a negotiating party. Tell your king I have a proposal. Sylvia was already holding the file. She had titled it Kingdom Acquisition Plan. Penalty clauses set to the maximum. The throne room smelled like mildew and the quiet panic of men who knew the floor was about to disappear but had not told each other yet. I did not kneel. I stood on the red carpet, the only clean person in a room full of men who had forgotten what clean looked like. The king sat on a gilded throne, cheeks hollow, eyes ringed dark. His ministers stared at the documents in Sylvia's arms, the way a drowning man watches a boat decide whether to stop. The prime minister demanded I donate everything to the crown. He called it mercy. He called it noble obligation. I agreed that service to the nation was admirable. Then I asked if we could settle the existing account first. Sylvia delivered the invoice. It landed with a sound that belonged in a courtroom, not a throne room. The prime minister's hands began to shake by the third page. I had spent months buying every outstanding debt the kingdom owed. unpaid guild invoices, mercenary wages, the hero party's expense accounts. Every line item acquired at discount from creditors who had given up on collecting. 80 billion gold coins, I said. Roughly 3 years of your national budget. The knight commander drew his sword and called me a traitor. I pulled an apple from storage, tossed it, caught it, took a bite. The crisp snap echoed through the chamber. 3 ministers swallowed at the same time. Kill me if you like, but my logistics network locks the moment I stop breathing. Your food supply, your armory, your hospitals, all dark. This apple becomes the last fresh produce in this capital. The knight commander did not move. The king laughed, a dry, broken sound. He ordered his guards to seize me. Every door opened. Armed men poured in. The knight commander pressed his blade to my throat. Sylvia, time? 2 in the afternoon. On schedule, President. Execute the special recovery protocol. I snapped my fingers. The knight commander's sword turned to light and vanished. His armor followed. Every guard in the room lost every piece of equipment in the span of a breath. Returned to the vendors who had never been paid. 40 armed men became 40 men in their underclothes, standing around the only person still wearing a suit. The chandelier disappeared. The tapestries. The carpet peeled itself off the floor. The room became bare stone. Then the king's crown dissolved, his mantle. The gilded throne vanished from under him. He hit cold stone in his undershirt. A thin old man shivering, surrounded by men who could no longer pretend they had power over anything. Every item was purchased on credit, I said. Unpaid invoices revert ownership to the creditor. I just processed the returns. He crawled to me, grabbed my trouser leg, begged for his dignity. Dignity is what you have after you pay what you owe. I dropped the contract on the bare stone. No ink left in the room. He bit his own finger and signed in blood. Full authority. Unconditional. I snapped my fingers. A single cheap robe materialized over his shoulders. No crown, no throne, just enough cloth to survive the night. Your credit rating allows for that. Build a repayment history, and we can discuss upgrades. I turned and left. Company posters were already going up on the castle walls. Sylvia fell into step beside me. An excellent enforcement, she said. I loosened my tie. Next item, Ethan. Someone needs to work off the cost of every piece of furniture that just left that room, she laughed. A small, precise sound. The kind of laugh that meant she had already drawn up the work order. 3 days after I took the castle, a status report from the infrastructure division crossed my desk. The capital's sewer system was half collapsed and decades overdue for expansion. My company had won the municipal contract the same afternoon I signed the authority transfer. Nobody else bid because the job was miserable and the site sat underneath the slum district where the air tasted like wet rot. Perfect for us. The report included a labor manifest from the subcontractor running the dig crews. Halfway down the list, a name caught my eye. Ethan. Not Ethan, S-rank Holy Knight. Just Ethan, day laborer, crew 7, copper 10 daily rate. Below him, Mira, laborer, Grant, laborer. I had not put them there. I did not need to. When every guild blacklists you and every merchant house bolts its doors, the only employers left are the ones who do not check names. And the biggest source of those jobs was Leonardo Trading Company. The orc site supervisor ran the dig with a whip crack and a schedule. According to the foreman's log, Ethan showed up on day 1 wearing rags of his old armor, tried to bark orders, and got kicked into the mud before he finished his first sentence. By day 3, he was hauling stone in silence, hands bleeding where the carrying frame cut into his palms. Without the enchanted bracers, I used to oil for him every night. Without the stamina potions, I brewed in bulk. His body was just a body, ordinary, fragile, the kind of thing that fails after 40 minutes of honest labor. Mira's golden hair was caked brown, her fingernails split from brickwork. Grant swung a pickaxe with the speed of someone 3 times his age. At lunch, the company supply truck arrived with hot meals for the full-time crew. Thick-cut steak, fresh bread, cold ale. The day laborers got thin soup and stale crusts. Ethan watched the regular workers eat. Then he saw the logo on the truck, Leonardo Trading Company, Civil Engineering Division. The foreman noted that the day laborer in Crew 7 dropped his bread into the mud and did not pick it up. He stared at the logo for a long time. Then he took up his shovel and went back into the trench without a word. I closed the report. What I felt was closer to the satisfaction of a ledger that balances every entry where it belongs, every debt in its correct column. He was digging my sewers because the math led him there, and math does not hold grudges. The alarm bells started at noon on the third day. I was reviewing textile procurement contracts on the upper terrace when Sylvia set a field report and a cup of tea at my elbow. Tea first, then the report. 50,000. Demons marching from the northern wastes in battle formation. Orcs in the vanguard with siege axes. Gargoyles overhead. Siege engines in the rear column. The kingdom's defense force was 3,000 soldiers in borrowed farm clothes, armed with cooking pots and sticks. Because I had recalled every piece of unpaid military equipment 72 hours ago, the former king found me on the wall, shaking so badly his robe fluttered. He demanded I do something. "They are not here to fight," I said. "They are hungry." I had been watching the demon supply lines for 6 weeks, cross-referenced trade route data against agricultural output from 3 border provinces. Their farmland was dying, ration stores in deficit for 2 consecutive seasons. This invasion was not ideology, it was calories. 50,000 soldiers burning their last provisions on a forced march, gambling that the capital's storehouses held enough grain to keep their children alive through winter. A logistics problem in a military uniform, my specialty. I touched my earpiece. All vehicles, engines on, gate open. Plan B, saturation catering, execute. The main gate groaned wide. The knights panicked. The orc general at the front of the demon line stopped dead because gates do not open toward an invading army unless something has gone differently than planned. 50 silver trucks roared through the opening in a single column. They crossed the gap at full throttle and braked 10 meters from the demon front line. Dust erupted. The general raised his axe. Then the cargo doors opened. Steam, rolling clouds of it, carrying the smell of grilled steak, fresh bread, spice sauce, and cold ale. Speakers on every roof played a recorded message, my voice, welcoming the demon army to our complimentary catering service. Thick-cut steak, artisan bread, draft ale, free with first-time registration. The general screamed it was poisoned. His soldiers' stomachs answered in unison, a rumble that came up through the ground itself. Weeks of forced marching on moldy jerky and ditch water had done what no castle wall ever could. One orc broke formation, grabbed a stake, bit through it. His scream, raw, joyful, half sobbing, carried across the plain. That was the end of the invasion. Weapons hit the dirt by the thousands. The army dissolved into a standing buffet. My employees moved through the crowd with catered event professionalism, portioning meat, pouring ale, collecting registration forms. From the battlements, 3,000 half-dressed knights watched in total silence. I sipped tea, still warm. Sylvia had timed it perfectly. Stomach secured. Now I need the head. I set the cup down. Open a teleport gate to the Demon Queen's throne room. We have a merger to negotiate. The throne room was colder than I expected. Black stone pillars climbed to a ceiling lost in darkness. The floor was polished obsidian, reflective enough that I could see my own shoes in it. At the far end, on a throne carved from a single block of volcanic glass, sat the Demon Queen, Cecilia, 13th of her line, midnight gown pooling around her like spilled ink, twin horns curving from her temples, pale skin, red eyes, and the kind of beauty that existed specifically to make you forget she could kill you before you finished admiring it. She did not stand when I stepped through the gate. The killing pressure radiating from her filled the room the way cold fills a cellar. She spoke first, quiet, each word wrapped in enough magic to vibrate the walls. She observed that I had fed her soldiers generously and wanted to know why I thought that entitled me to keep my legs. Catering services, promotional rates this week. The flagstone beneath my right foot exploded. Her finger had barely moved. The barrier woven into my suit lining absorbed the blast. She told me to stop playing. Her people were warriors, not livestock. I straightened my tie, took the proposal from my jacket, and placed it on the floor between us. Before you kill me, read page 1. She did not touch it, so I opened a projection display, holographic charts, population curves, trade flows, and walked her through the numbers. Agricultural yield declining for 6 consecutive seasons. Mineral exports with no buyers because human nations refuse to trade with demons. Population growing faster than food production. The invasion she launched was not strategy. It was a nation starving and throwing bodies at the problem because fighting was the only economic tool in the box. Within 6 months, her eastern provinces would begin mandatory rationing. Within a year, the famine would reach her capital. Within 2, her soldiers would eat their boots before they ate their pride, and no ancestral tradition would fill a child's stomach. She summoned a blade and pressed it against my throat. The edge bit skin. Blood ran down my collar. Her hand trembled. She said her people had survived 1,000 years on strength alone. That selling sovereignty to a merchant was worse than starvation. That I understood nothing about the weight of a crown. "You have not survived," I said, feeling the blade shift with my pulse. "You have been dying slowly and calling it heritage." Silence until I could hear the torches guttering on the walls. I pointed at the file. A full merger proposal. Not charity, not a peace treaty. A business contract. Salary guarantees for every demon employee. Food supply agreements indexed to my company's output. Infrastructure development across their territory. In exchange, labor capacity and raw material access. Orcs for construction. Gargoyles for aerial logistics. The mineral deposits in their southern mountains that had no buyers because no human merchant had survived the border crossing. This is not a rescue, it is a transaction. You have assets I need. I have food you need. The alternative is you march home and watch your people starve while I find the labor somewhere else. She lowered the sword. Her composure held, but at the seams I could see the weight cracking through. Not weakness, but the burden of a choice no ruler should make alone. One night, "Give me until dawn." Done. I turned toward the gate, paused. The executive compensation package is on page 12. There is an unlimited confectionery clause, in case it affects your deliberation. Her shoulders went rigid, not a smile. Something fighting toward one through 1,000 years of armor. I stepped through the gate before she could answer. Dawn broke over the demon waste like a slow exhale. Cecilia was on the balcony when I arrived. Below, 50,000 soldiers slept in the open air. Not the rigid sleep of men bracing for casualties, but the loose sprawl of people who had eaten their fill and expected to wake up alive. An orc had curled around his shield like a child clutching a stuffed animal. A gargoyle had folded its wings over 2 smaller demons to keep them warm. The air smelled like campfire coffee. Not blood, not rust. She had been standing there all night. I could tell from her spine, rigid, locked, the posture of someone who had watched every sleeping face and weighed each one against her pride. "Your answer?" She turned. The doubt was gone. What replaced it was the face of a leader who had chosen her people over her inheritance and would carry that choice for the rest of her reign. "I will sign one condition." Her voice was quiet and absolute. "My people will never be treated as slaves. Their dignity will be protected, their skills fairly compensated. Violate that clause, and I will tear the contract apart with you still holding it." Her eyes burned crimson. The oath compressed the air between us until breathing took effort. Agreed. The clause was already in the contract. Page 12, Section 4. I did not need to think about it. I do not build systems that break their workers. It is inefficient and creates liability. She stared at me. She had prepared arguments, counteroffers, concessions to make if I pushed back. Immediate acceptance of the one thing that mattered most to her left her for 3 full seconds without a plan. I set the contract on the balcony railing. She took the pen. Her hand was steady. The binding seal pulsed with light. Merchant Guild standard, witnessed and recorded. When the glow faded, the document was law in both worlds. I extended my hand. She hesitated 1 heartbeat. 1,000 years of species war compressed into that breath. Then gripped it. Small hand, stronger than it looked. "Make my kingdom profitable," she said. "That is not a request. Already in progress." I activated the earpiece. All units, restructuring phase 1. Department heads to the assembly ground. New equipment inbound. She spoke once more as I turned to leave, quieter. The desert clause had better be real. Every word. 1 week later, the demon army returned to the capital. The former king collapsed against the battlement railing. Sentries sounded the alarm. The half-dressed knights grabbed pot lids and broomsticks and formed a shaking line. 50,000 figures in tight formation. dust cloud consuming the northern horizon. The lookout adjusted his scope, went quiet. They were not carrying weapons. They were carrying shovels. The orc vanguard wore dark blue coveralls and yellow hard hats, patches on the chest, Leonardo construction. Behind them, the gargoyle air wing with delivery packs strapped to their backs, green caps, express shipping labels fluttering. Behind them, the administrative corps in pressed office attire, carrying clipboards instead of battle standards. It was not an invasion. It was the largest organized commute the capital had ever seen. The orc general, now senior site supervisor, stopped at the gate, raised a bullhorn, and announced in a voice that loosened mortar from the wall that his name was Garrett, and he was here to begin infrastructure rehabilitation. He apologized for the noise. His crews dispersed with military precision, repurposed for construction. One orc moved a stone block that would have taken 10 humans an afternoon. Gargoyles airlifted quarry materials in hours instead of weeks. The administrative division processed permits with the efficiency of a command staff that had swapped war plans for work orders. I arrived by company car with Cecilia beside me. She had traded her midnight gown for a dark blazer. The horns stayed. The reading glasses were new. She watched an orc crew hoist a 4-ton block into place barehanded while singing a work song, and something quiet shifted across her face. "They are smiling," she said. "I have never seen them smile on a march." Different incentive structure. The old one was die for glory. The new one is hot lunch at noon, and overtime, pay past the 6th hour. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. I chose not to confirm. From street level, I could see the sewer trench where Ethan's crew worked. The demon teams filed past in orderly formation, hard hats straight, tools over shoulders, company patches visible. An orc foreman glanced down at the human laborers in the ditch and gave a short nod. Ethan looked up, knee-deep in mud, hands raw, clothes stiff with filth. He watched 300 demons in matching uniforms march past toward the reconstruction of the city he had once sworn to defend with a holy sword. He nodded back, small, reflexive, the motion of a man who had stopped fighting the current and started learning to swim in it. Sylvia placed the Week 1 integration report on my desk that evening. I had not heard her come in. Garrett's division completed the eastern wall, the northern aqueduct, and 14 kilometers of road resurfacing. She set a cup beside the file. Cecilia submitted her first departmental budget, tight but realistic. She underestimated office supply costs by 11%. I corrected it. Ethan, still in the sewer. His foreman noted he has stopped talking to his crew. Works double shifts voluntarily. She paused. He is beginning to understand. Good, let him. I drank the tea. Right temperature, as always. That is the only education that sticks. The kind you pay for in blisters. I turned back to the window. Somewhere below, the man who fired me was hauling stone for my company at 10 copper coins a day. Across a dimensional gate, a demon queen was learning to read profit and loss statements with the intensity she once brought to battle maps. And between them, 50,000 former soldiers were discovering that building something was harder and more satisfying than breaking it. 2 civilizations, 1 payroll. The kingdom needed a workforce. The demon realm needed an economy. My contract bridged both. I closed the report and opened the next file. The Southern Border Dispatch could wait until morning. 2 in the morning and the floor was a hive. Hundreds of employees in rolled sleeves, sweat on their foreheads, eyes burning with the specific glow of people doing something impossible and winning. The project code was saturation feed. The objective was simple: hit 50,000 incoming demon soldiers with so much food that they surrendered to their own stomachs before a single blade was drawn. Reports poured in like artillery. 3rd warehouse, dried meat, packed to target. Northern Harbor Guild, 50 tons of fish confirmed at double rate. Cash on delivery, ships by dawn. Teleport gate clearance, wrestled from the Ministry of Magic by an entertainment committee that had spent more on wine than most villages earned in a season. I authorized the expense without blinking. The gate connection alone would cut our transport time in half. I walked the floor with my jacket off and my tie loose, a nutrition potion in one hand instead of coffee. The progress board was beautiful, red completion stamps cascading down the Gantt chart like dominoes falling in sequence. 5,000 cattle to process, 50,000 uniforms to stitch. Every cloth merchant in the capital stripped clean, and every food factory running fire-made shifts for precision searing. Outside crisp, inside tender, quality standard met. Then it hit a wall. The garment division chief, a stout dwarf named Thornton, came running with panic in his eyes. The extra-large orc uniforms had run out of blue dye. Every supplier in the capital was dry. The uniforms were not optional. Matching clothes turned soldiers into employees. Without them, the psychological shift would not land. I did not hesitate. Blue slime, I said. Southern wetlands. Their fluid is a permanent dye. Post an emergency quest to the Adventurer Guild. 10 times the normal buyback rate. Call it a harvest festival. Thornton's face went from white to bright in under a second. He sprinted for the communications desk. That was the rhythm. Problem. Solution. Next problem. The speed was the engine, and the engine did not idle. Sylvia materialized beside me with a fresh potion and a look that was 3 parts composure, 1 part quiet concern. She told me I had been awake for 40 hours. And I am having, I said, draining the bottle, the time of my life. The eastern sky was turning pale. Below the windows, headlights fanned out from every factory in the capital, a river of light converging on the northern staging point. Those trucks carried steak and bread and uniforms, and housing kits and safety manuals. Not a single weapon among them, the commercial equivalent of an open hand. Look at that, Sylvia. That is what we are. She stood beside me at the glass. It is beautiful, sir. Last push. The presentation for the Demon Queen goes out at noon, in physical form. Everything cooked, everything folded, everything loaded. Move. The roar that answered shook the ceiling tiles. Exhaustion did not exist in a room this alive. I had spent years maintaining equipment for people who never noticed. Now, I was running an operation where every person on the floor knew exactly what they were building and wanted to build it faster. Same hour, same precision, different world. The throne room had been stripped to the bone, chandelier repossessed, carpet seized. The vaulted ceiling looked naked without its gilding. Where the throne once stood, a single folding chair held a trembling old man in a stained robe, former King Aldrich, 7th of his name, last of his line. Around him, a ring of former ministers stood shivering in their underclothes, every garment above the waist confiscated against outstanding personal debts. Merchants, foreign diplomats, and guild observers filled the gallery. They whispered the way people whisper at funerals when the casket is already in the ground. Sylvia read the auction notice in a voice suited to a train schedule. The debtor, the Royal House of Alban, had defaulted on all obligations. The collateral, sovereign governance rights, and the entirety of the national territory was now at public auction. She listed the assets, land, population, infrastructure, in advanced decay. She listed the liabilities, 800 billion gold owed to Leonardo Trading Company. The room did the math. 800 billion in debt attached to whoever signed the purchase. A kingdom-shaped anchor tied to the bottom of the ocean. Nobody bid, of course not. I had made certain every other eligible buyer was disqualified weeks in advance. Outstanding counterclaims, unresolved debt relationships, registration irregularities. The auction notices had gone to the right parties at the right time, carrying the right information to ensure they all reached the same conclusion. Not worth the risk. Sylvia began reading the dissolution clause. I raised my hand. Every head turned. I walked to the folding chair, reached into my pocket, and flipped a single copper coin onto the old man's knee. It landed with a sound smaller than a heartbeat. 1 copper, the minimum legal opening bid. No competing bidders. I bought a kingdom for the price of a bread roll. The old man's hands shook as he closed his fingers around the coin. He begged me to save his people. Tears on his cheeks, voice broken, the last dignity of a man who had spent a lifetime being told he was important, discovering in a single morning the exact market value of that importance. Sylvia's gavel cracked once. The sound echoed off bare stone. I sat in the folding chair, still warm from him, crossed one leg over the other, and looked at the row of half-dressed former nobles. Their positions were terminated, effective immediately. Replacements were already on my payroll. For those who wished to remain employed, construction sites outside were hiring at 10 copper coins a day under orc supervisors who did not care about bloodlines. They screamed that the country could not function without them. I told them the country had stopped functioning suffering because of them, and the proof was the 800 billion reasons I was sitting in this chair. Security, company guards now, not royal, escorted them out. Some wept, some cursed. The room smelled cleaner after. I stood at the window. Below, the royal crest descended the tower flagpole for the last time. In its place climbed a banner bearing golden scales on a dark field, the Leonardo Trading Company standard, catching the wind like it had always belonged there. No blood, no army, no siege, just arithmetic and a copper coin. 3 years passed. They passed the way good systems pass time, quietly, reliably, with the particular grace of things that work without being watched. The world map on my wall no longer said Kingdom of Alban. It said Leonardo Economic Special Zone, and it was the most prosperous territory on the continent. The capital had a skyline now. Crystal glass towers rose above what used to be the castle district, taller than the keep I had purchased for a copper. Below, geometric road networks carried freight trucks and public buses, in patterns I had sketched on a napkin 3 years ago. Gargoyle couriers flew overhead in formation, cargo containers strapped to their backs. On the ground, orcs and humans walked into the same taverns at shift change without reaching for anything sharper than a beer glass. No war, no famine, just logistics, revenue, and a population that slept well because tomorrow was guaranteed to function. Cecilia walked in, wearing the dark blazer she had adopted over her gown, reading glasses balanced on the bridge of her nose between her horns. Her title was Branch Director, Demon World Division. Her actual function was the person most likely to tell me I was wrong and have the spreadsheet to prove it. She set the quarterly report on my desk. Consolidated revenue, 150% above last year. Demon Realm tourism and dungeon rare metal exports leading the growth. She paused and adjusted her glasses in the way she always did before admitting something she considered emotionally inconvenient. Fighting was never this exciting, she said. You were always built for this, I said. Her cheeks colored half a shade. She redirected immediately to the proposed Western expansion corridor and the budget gap she intended to win from me before the meeting ended. Sylvia had already poured tea and prepared 2 contract drafts, one for each possible outcome of the argument. This was the routine. Cecilia pushed, I held. Sylvia prepared for whoever won. The machine ran itself. On the wall monitor, a construction site feed showed Ethan barking at a crew of new hires. Sunburned face, calloused hands, clean company work clothes. He was yelling about proper lifting technique and safety checks. The foreman's quarterly review had nominated him for the Top Employee Award. The recommendation note read, complains constantly, outworks everyone, will move mountains for the dinner steak. I approved a bonus and a voucher for the expensive steakhouse on the main avenue. Sylvia made the note without a word. The world outside my window had not been built by a sword. It had been built by delivery schedules, wage contracts, and a man who understood what happened when the supply chain stopped. I leaned back and looked at it, really looked, and felt something close to peace. Then I turned to the older map on my desk. The human world was running. The demon world was profitable. Everything below a certain altitude was covered. What about above? I said. Cecilia leaned forward. The divine realm. You cannot possibly be serious. They have customers up there, I said. And from what I hear, they are deeply, profoundly bored. She stared at me. Sylvia was already drafting the project charter. Outside the capital, on a stretch of Western Highway, the rain had shifted the road. Garrett caught it at 6 in the morning during his walkthrough. 3 centimeters of lateral displacement in the foundation stones, invisible to anyone who is not looking for it. Garrett was always looking. He had ordered the soil composition analysis added to the daily morning briefing a month ago. Nobody before him had thought to include it. The human engineers ran their routes by eye and by experience. Garrett ran his by data, because when an orc builds something and it fails, nobody blames the soil. They blame the orc. He refused to give them the chance. His crew was half former Demon Army soldiers, half human day laborers, men and women who had been on Kingdom patronage payroll doing nothing for years and had now discovered that real labor had a rhythm. Garrett set the rhythm. He showed up first. He read the reports before anyone else arrived. He never asked his crew to lift a stone he had not already carried himself. The human crew lead arrived, saw the shifted stones, and started ordering a surface patch. Garrett stopped him. He pulled out the moisture data from the overnight rainfall and pointed to the subgrade saturation levels. A patch would hold a week. Resetting the foundation properly would hold a decade. The crew lead studied the numbers. He asked how Garrett had known to check. "I read," Garrett said. "Every morning. They reset the stones. 4 extra hours. No cost overrun. The road held. It is still holding. I learned about it from a single line in a weekly field report 2 days later." Garrett, senior site supervisor, West Arterial, foundation correction, 4-hour delay, 0 budget impact. The kind of entry that means someone cared more about the work than the schedule. I circled it and wrote in the margin, "Promote to regional logistics coordinator, effective next quarter." The orc who once commanded soldiers into siege formations now commanded construction crews into the rain. His road was better than anything the kingdom's engineers had produced in a century. Not because his people were stronger, because Garrett read the soil reports, and nobody before him had bothered. The former king's new castle was a 4.5 mat room with no bath and a shared toilet down the hall. Sylvia's population tracking system did not distinguish between royalty and warehouse clerks. His employee file crossed my desk during a routine audit, and I read it the way I read everything, looking for what the numbers said when the person was not trying to speak. His mornings started at a communal well, washing his face with a chipped ladle, cold water, no silver basin, no servant. He had been assigned to the sorting line at our central warehouse. Potion bottles, inventory tags, manifests. His supervisor called him slow but meticulous. Decades of reviewing state documents nobody else bothered to read had given him exactly one transferable skill, and he was using it. The young floor manager yelled at him when he misfiled a shipment, called him old man, told him to earn his wage, not reminisce about his title. There was no deference in that warehouse. Nobody cared that his signature had once appeared on treaties. They cared whether the labels matched the contents, and when he got it right, nobody praised him, and when he got it wrong, someone told him. The community feedback survey was where it got interesting. The stall owner on the Lower East Street, grilled skewers, cheap ale, red lanterns, reported that the same elderly man came every evening after shift, sat on a wooden crate, ordered the same thing, ale, chicken skin, gizzard, salt, stayed until closing, tipped when he could. The ale cost less than the water his servants used to draw his bath, and the stall owner said he was the most contented regular he had ever served. I closed the file. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel guilt. I felt the quiet weight of watching someone find something true in the rubble of something hollow. He had been surrounded by hyenas for decades, courtiers whispering that the debt was manageable, that his decisions were brilliant, that everything was fine. Out here, the air smelled like warehouse dust and charcoal smoke and earned sweat, and nobody lied to him because nobody had a reason to. Through the gap between the stall's canvas panels, the Leonardo Tower was visible, taller than the castle, carrying every pressure he had been freed from. He had told the stall owner once that he would not trade places with the man in that tower for anything in the world. I believed him. The system I built did not care about your past. It cared whether you showed up. For a man who had spent a lifetime being told he was important, the discovery that ordinary was enough turned out to be the only freedom he had ever needed. Garrett's monthly site report was where I found Ethan's vow, filed under personnel notes, in the dry prose of a foreman who did not waste adjectives. Worker Ethan had identified a drainage gradient error on the highway's 12th section before the inspection crew arrived. A farmer whose road would have flooded at the next heavy rain had stopped by the site and thanked him directly. Not the company, not the foreman, Ethan, by name, for catching the flaw. What the report could not capture, what I learned later through the community survey system, was what happened that evening at the tavern. They were rain-soaked and aching. Ethan's hands were torn where blisters had split against the shovel handle. The enchanted blade he used to carry had weighed more, but it came with stat bonuses and the comfortable lie that strength was something you were born with. The shovel offered no such illusions. Mira sat beside him, the former saint, now pushing wheelbarrows with mud on her cheeks. Grant was across the table, the heavy fighter turned pipe hauler. They had stayed together, not out of loyalty to the dead party, but because old instincts transferred. The coordination that had carried them through boss chambers now carried them through mud. Payday. Ethan ordered the biggest mugs on the menu and stew for the table. Grant asked if he was sure. Ethan said the attendance bonus had come through, and besides, he owed them for every year he had spent being insufferable. Mira said she wished she had recorded that. Grant laughed until the table shook. Then Ethan told them. He said the farmer's thanks had hit harder than any sword. In his hero days, gratitude had come by the thousands. Save us, great hero. But none of it was aimed at him. It was aimed at the title, the armor, the legend. Strip those away, and there was nothing worth thanking. But yesterday, a man had thanked him for a drainage grade, for a road that would hold. He raised his glass and said he was going to become the best site supervisor in the country. Better than Leo. He did not say it with hatred. He said it the way a craftsman names a standard he intends to exceed. Not a grudge, not a fantasy, but a benchmark. His companions ordered another round. The evening ended with all three of them arguing about fried chicken. I read the report. I filed it. The man who had fired me was building roads under my banner and swearing to outperform me at it. I was not sure what to call that feeling. It was not triumph. It was not resentment. It might have been the closest thing I had to respect for someone finally earning it. Cecilia was buried in the rare metal export pipeline, orc labor compliance codes, gargoyle freight routing, dwarf pricing negotiations layered 3 deep, when I slid the macaron box across the desk. She opened it without looking up, picked up the raspberry one, and bit into it before her brain registered what her hand had done. She paused, chewed. Something shifted behind her eyes. Bribery, she said. Employee wellness initiative for leadership. The macarons were from the confectionery district. 7 shops now, in a neighborhood that had not existed 3 years ago. The profit margin was absurd. People paid it anyway, because a moment that tasted like something was worth more than a moment that did not. She reached for the pistachio one, ate it slowly, leaning back in the ergonomic chair she had once called decadent and now refused to relinquish. World conquest, she said, was a terrible return on investment. Burn the fields, kill the farmers, seize land that produces nothing because you destroyed the people who made it produce. Negative yield on every campaign. Took your dynasty 13 generations to reach that conclusion. 12. The first queen understood. She lacked your supply chain. She looked at the city lights, the same lights she had once planned to incinerate. Selling humans what they already want is more efficient than seizing what they have, and more satisfying. She paused. I will deny having said that. Partner, I said, a minute later. The word landed somewhere behind her composure. She turned, adjusted her glasses between her horns in the way she did when something had hit closer than she wanted. Do not read into that, she said, too quickly. I am still planning to absorb this company the moment you look away. I know. That is what the macarons are for. She huffed, pulled the next report from the pile. I turned back to mine. The office was quiet except for pens and the low hum of a city that could run itself. She ate a third macaron. Neither of us commented. The intelligence report arrived wrapped in a job application. Sylvia placed the file on my desk with the expression she wore when something was simultaneously ridiculous and strategically material. I had to read it twice because the first pass was lost to laughter. The operative was from the Galatia Empire, the power beyond the Western Mountains, sent to assess our vulnerability and determine whether military invasion was feasible. He had crossed the border expecting a failed state. His account described with the clinical detachment of a man whose composure was decomposing one paragraph at a time. What he found instead: paved highways so smooth that farm carts outpaced imperial cavalry, orc construction crews performing morning exercises beside human workers, helmets polished, voices coordinated, an elderly woman offering candy to one of the orcs. He reported experiencing dizziness at that point. He visited a worker's canteen, ordered the cheapest meal, 5 copper, expecting gruel. What arrived was seasoned pork, hot rice, fresh soup, vegetables that glistened. He wrote in the same flat tone he would have used to log a troop count that he wept. Imperial soldiers survived on hard bread and thin broth. Here, a common laborer ate better than his emperor. His conclusion: if the Empire's soldiers tasted this country's food, they would desert. No patriotism could compete. Military action was structurally impossible. Then the report ended and a resignation letter began. He had quit the Imperial service, walked to our employment office, and applied for the security division. Starting salary, 3 times an Imperial general's wage. He attached his entire intelligence dossier to the application, the way someone someone might include a letter of reference. I filed the report under market research. Sylvia noted the Galatia Empire's espionage capability as present but demoralized. I told her a pork dinner and a benefits package had just neutralized an entire foreign intelligence operation. She did not smile, but her pen paused 1 second longer than necessary. The world outside my window was running. Former enemies had found real lives. Former spies had found better employers. Cecilia was 3 floors down with macaron crumbs on her blazer. Ethan was somewhere in the rain, building roads and swearing he would surpass me. I looked at the map on my wall. Human world, covered. Demon world, profitable. Everything below a certain altitude was accounted for. Above that line was the divine realm, gods, ancient resources, and an economy that had never been touched. I opened a new file and wrote the heading, Preliminary Assessment, Divine Realm Commercial Opportunities. The world I had built was working. Time to build a bigger one. There are 2 ways to rule the world, violence or commerce. I had chosen commerce. Human nations folded into my supply chain. Demon armies absorbed through merger and acquisition. My commercial territory stretched to every horizon. But a merchant's greed is a deep sickness. Once every edge of the map is filled, you reach for what lies beyond it. My leather shoes struck the ground with a clean, hard sound. The divine realm, a world stripped of color. No sun, the entire sky radiated the same uniform milky light, and nothing cast a shadow. Beneath my feet stretched a seamless white corridor, jointless, dustless. This place did not permit the residue that comes with being alive. Behind me, Cecilia's breathing had gone ragged. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Every demonic instinct she possessed was rejecting this space the way a body rejects a transplant. Sylvia gripped her tablet with trembling fingers. The pressure here was not atmospheric. It was weighted silence, physical, massive, pressing down as though the air intended to flatten anything imperfect out of existence. I locked my knees through will alone. Fear? No. This was the shiver before a deal closes. Ahead lay an untouched market no mortal had ever entered. Let's move. The customers are waiting. The corridor opened into a vast plaza. Gods. They resembled humans, but something fundamental was different. Proportions built on golden ratios. Skin smooth as fired porcelain. Eyes clear and empty as glass marbles. They stood doing nothing. No conversation, no eating, no movement, staring into the middle distance as though they had been standing that way for 10,000 years. Boredom. In commerce, boredom is the greatest opportunity that exists. I plastered on the sales face that had closed kingdoms and introduced myself, a merchant from the mortal world, bearing cuisine and entertainment fit to color their eternal monotony. Sylvia opened the sample wagon. Cecilia dispersed the aroma of our signature product, dragon steak marinated in premium elixir, the kind of scent that had triggered riots in the human world. Nothing. The gods looked at us the way you look at a pebble on the road. No hunger, no curiosity, not even disgust. One of them spoke, flat, toneless. He said they were complete. Hunger, thirst, boredom. None of it existed here. What we had brought was impurity, and impurity was unnecessary. He flicked my finest vintage off the table with a casual backhand. The bottle shattered on the white floor. Red liquid spread across the alabaster like a bloodstain. I scrambled, offered jewels, entertainment devices, rare liquors, one after another, like a man emptying his pockets at gunpoint. Nothing landed. The gods turned away. Not rejection. Something crueler, complete indifference. My pitch had been denied at the level of its premise. A merchant with no demand is not a merchant at all. I panicked, reached for the item box. My entire fortune. Gold would translate. Gold was the universal language. A cold system tone rang through my skull. Unauthorized access. The item box had been classified as a code violation against the fundamental architecture of this realm. Freeze initiated. Something severed, like a nerve cut clean. My hand closed on empty air. 800 billion gold coins. Every product, weapon, contract, and reserve I had accumulated across years, locked behind a door that no longer recognized my hand. Then the weight hit from above. My knees cracked against the marble. Golden wings filled my peripheral vision. A tall goddess, blindfolded, holding a massive pair of scales. Diana, goddess of order. She identified me as a systemic error, a mortal whose supply network had distorted the natural flow of resource distribution across the continent. The gods distribute fate, weather, harvest, and disaster through architecture that assumes no single mortal controls distribution at my scale. I was not being punished for trespassing. I was being removed the way you remove a corrupted file. She tilted her scales. The floor vanished. We fell. Through the roar of wind, I looked up. Diana watched us drop the way you watch trash go down a chute. I had lost. Not through negotiation, not through being outbid, through being classified as irrelevant and discarded. The white world shrank to a point, then disappeared. The smell hit first, not garbage, something older. The sweet, cloying rot of concepts that had curdled, purpose gone rancid over centuries of disuse. I dragged myself out of the rubble. My suit was torn in half a dozen places, stained with a black, oily substance that clung to my hands like the residue of things that had once been sacred. Cecilia and Sylvia found me, both intact. Neither looked at me with pity. The expressions were worse. They looked at me the way you look at someone you followed into a building that just collapsed. I tried the item box, reached into empty space. No error tone, no rejection. The connection was simply gone, like flexing a muscle that had been removed. I tried again and again, clawing at air. An old figure shuffled out from behind a mound of debris. Skeletal frame, soil-colored skin, existence so thin he was nearly translucent. A single broken wing still grew from his back. A god, barely. He told me this was the graveyard of oblivion, the end of the line. Gods of rivers that had dried up, patrons of empires that had collapsed, the divine overseer of a sport no civilization remembered how to play. They sat in the gray and waited, because waiting was all there was. I sat on a broken column, not dark, not light. A faint glow leaked from the crack far above, enough to see shapes, but not colors. Everything was gray, the rubble. The fallen gods sprawled across it. The air did not move. No wind, no temperature, no texture, just flat, dead stillness. I had bought nations, tamed armies, built the largest commercial empire in history, and now I was sitting on a rock in heaven's garbage dump with nothing in my pockets and nothing left of the machine I had spent years constructing. A merchant who has nothing to sell is not a merchant. He is just a man sitting in the dirt. I do not know how long I sat there. Time does not register in a place where nothing changes. Then a crack across my cheekbone, and the gray world tilted sideways. Cecilia had slapped me. Not the wild swing of someone losing control. A precise, deliberate strike. The kind of hit that takes a decision to deliver. Her eyes burned, not with pity, with fury built on top of fear. The way she always processes being scared, by converting it into something she can aim. She grabbed my collar and pulled me upright, told me she had sold the demon world to me. Her armies, her throne, her kingdom, everything, handed over because she believed a merchant with a ledger was more dangerous than a queen with a sword. She had staked her entire legacy on that belief. And now what? The words cut through the dead air like something that did not belong in it. No gold? No skill? So the merchant soul you sold me on was something that only existed inside a storage box? Was it that cheap? The slap still burned. The words burned worse, because she was right. I had confused the tool with the talent. The item box had never been the source. I was the source. The box was just the drawer I kept things in. 3 meters away, Sylvia was kneeling on a flat slab of rubble with a salvaged notebook balanced on her thigh. She had been writing since we landed. Her skin was the color of paper. Her fingers shook, but she was writing because stopping was not in her architecture. She looked up, calm, precise. The same expression she wore when delivering quarterly reports in a sunlit office, except the office was a junkyard and the sunlight was gone. 23 fallen gods with residual divine energy, she read. A collection of inoperative divine artifacts with recoverable components, and a space with zero oversight from the upper realm. No patrols, no monitoring, no authority of any kind. She closed the notebook and waited. Something shifted behind my eyes. Not the gray lifting from the room, the gray lifting from me. Read me the energy levels on those 23 gods. What I built from the trash heap was a casino. Tables from wrecked divine furniture, cards cut from shattered crystal plates that still held a faint residual glow, chips denominated in divine energy, the power every fallen god still carried in their fading bodies. Too weak to be useful, but too persistent to disappear. They had nothing to spend it on. I gave them something. The old god with the broken wing was my first customer. I sat across from him, shuffled the handmade cards with a flourish that made the dead air stir, and offered a wager. If I won, 1 feather from his remaining wing, raw material. If he won, 1 year of my mortal lifespan, transferred through Cecilia's contract magic. Lifespan, the one commodity an immortal cannot generate. The faintest taste of finitude, of the urgency that makes every heartbeat matter. His clouded eyes lit with something that had not been there in centuries. A flicker, the seed of want. He took the bet. He lost. He played again. Within days, word had crawled through the graveyard. Forgotten gods rose from their rubble and shuffled toward the tables. Blackjack, poker, dice games scored on crystal boards. The stakes touched something primal. They were wagering fragments of their own divinity, and the possibility of losing made them feel alive for the first time in epochs. The god who had ignored my dragon stake without blinking was slamming his fist on the table because his card total had gone 1 point over. Cecilia dealt with military precision. Her corporate blazer rumpled, but her posture regal enough to command a throne room. She understood what I was building before I explained it, because she had once run an army the same way. Identify what your soldiers need, then position yourself between them and the supply. Sylvia tracked every transaction. Bottles of harvested divine energy lined the back wall of our tent, glowing gold in the darkness. The ledger grew thick. The house had its edge. I did not cheat. I never needed to. The math was always enough. Then the clientele shifted. Not just graveyard residents anymore. Mid-rank gods from the upper layers descended. Bored bureaucrats, underemployed minor deities, divine functionaries sneaking down on their breaks. The casino's reputation had leaked upward through the cracks in the realm's architecture. I opened a members-only section, repurposed broken temple columns into a private lounge, polished cracked holy chalices into wine glasses, draped salvaged tapestries across the walls until the room looked like a shrine to nostalgia. The mid-rank gods had pride. They would not sit at a common table in a dump, but an exclusive club assembled from the relics of their own discarded golden age. That was different. That felt like heritage dressed as privilege, and gods, it turned out, were as susceptible to that combination as any mortal. They whispered that Diana must never find out. The shared secret bound them to the tables tighter than any contract. Complicity is the strongest adhesive in any customer relationship. The bottles multiplied. The golden glow in the back of the tent grew until it looked less like storage and more like a vault. The hack happened after weeks of operation, in the deepest chamber of the graveyard, with every bottle we had filled arranged in concentric circles around the magic array. Hundreds of them. Golden light filled the room until it hurt to look at. Sylvia knelt at the edge of the circle, hands flat against the floor, face white as bone. The computational load of interfacing with a divine security system was burning through her like a brush fire. Cecilia stood at the energy conduit, condensing the collected divine energy into a focused stream. Veins stood blue against her skin. Even for a former demon queen, channeling this volume of raw divinity was measured in seconds before something gave. The target was the freeze on my soul. Diana had frozen the item box, not deleted it. Freezing was a recoverable state. Deletion would have required higher authority, and she had not escalated because she considered the matter resolved. That was her mistake. She had filed me under finished and moved on, because her system assumed that finished things stayed finished. The Divine Registry accepted divine authority as its authentication key, not mortal identity, divine authority. And I had accumulated enough of it, one blackjack hand at a time, to present a valid credential. I placed my hands on the terminal, a device cobbled from broken divine instruments, ugly as sin and functional enough to make a request the system could not ignore, and spoke. Begin. The bottles shattered in unison. Golden light flooded the circle in a roaring torrent. The system responded immediately. Warning tones filled my skull in a voice that sounded like Diana's. Unauthorized access. Authorization denied. Pressure crushed inward from every direction. Sylvia's nose began to bleed. Cecilia screamed through her teeth and pushed harder. A wall of white light materialized between me and the terminal. The divine firewall, order itself, refusing the intrusion. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a copper coin, battered, scratched, worthless by any measure this realm recognized. The first coin I had ever earned in the mortal world, back when I was nobody, back when the idea that I would one day buy nations was so absurd it would have been cruelty to suggest it. I pressed the coin into the terminal's core, not as currency, as a catalyst. It carried something the divine system had no field for, the bottomless greed of a man who started with nothing and decided the entire world was inventory waiting to be priced. Every late night in the warehouse, every deal closed on a handshake, every kingdom acquired with better arithmetic than the king had. That was not divine energy. It was want, pure and uncut, in a quantity that the goddess of order had never thought to account for. The white wall cracked, black fissures bled through the light. The system tone stuttered, glitched, collapsed into static. I hit the terminal one last time and the wall shattered. Silence. The golden bottles lay empty, spent to the last drop. Sylvia collapsed sideways. Cecilia doubled over, gasping, hands on her knees. And in front of me, a familiar tier opened in the air. Dark, deep, infinite, my item box. The confiscated contents were still gone. Diana held those, but the capability was back, the door, and inside it, waiting where I had placed it before we ever entered the divine realm, was the backup cache, sealed in a hidden partition outside the system's reach. I had planned for total loss before I took the first step through that gate. That was the job. Not because disaster was certain, but because preparing for it was the kind of thing that mattered exactly when it stopped getting done. I pulled out recovery elixir and knelt beside Sylvia first, then Cecilia. They had earned that priority. Then I pulled out a fresh suit, stripped off the ruined one in the golden half-light, buttoned the new shirt, knotted the tie, stepped into polished shoes. The graveyard was still gray. The fallen gods were still gambling at the tables I had built from their own discarded past. The divine energy was still flowing, but the man standing in the middle of it was no longer a refugee. I adjusted my cuffs and looked up, past the rubble, past the dim glow, toward the white world far above where Diana sat behind her scales and believed the matter was closed. It was not closed. The casino was running, the energy was accumulating, and I had my weapon back. I told Cecilia and Sylvia to rest and prepare. What came next was not survival. It was expansion. The gods were starving, not metaphorically. The upper realm, that pristine corridor of silence and golden ratios, had become a hospital ward. Deities who had not drawn a labored breath in 10,000 years leaned against the alabaster walls with grease-sheen sweat on foreheads that used to look like fired porcelain, skin the color of old paper, hands trembling, throats working dry swallows against nothing. From the deepest chamber of the graveyard, I watched Sylvia's surveillance feeds and understood it perfectly. The casino had done exactly what I built it to do. It had pushed stimulus through the floor into a system that had never encountered stimulus before. The thrill of a blackjack hand, the rush of doubling a bet, the first sip of wine in an eternal life that had never tasted anything. Those experiences kicked dormant processes back online. Hunger, thirst, anticipation, the full biological vocabulary of being alive. And now, every god in the upper realm was burning through stored divine energy at a rate their system had no category for, because their system had never needed the word metabolism. Complete stasis to full combustion. The rebound was elegant. The rebound was the plan. The sky became a screen. Every surface in the upper realm, every wall, every ceiling, every stretch of open air carried the same image simultaneously. A man in a clean dark suit standing before an open item box and a fleet of delivery wagons, broadcasting from the graveyard on equipment Sylvia had assembled from salvaged divine instruments during the casino weeks. "Good afternoon," I said. "You look unwell." The gods who had been gasping against the alabaster lifted their heads and stared at the sky, the way drowning men stare at a passing ship. "You turned my wine away once, called it impurity. You were right. A machine that does not move does not need fuel." I held the pause long enough for the silence to do its work. "But you are moving now. Your hearts are beating. Your throats are dry. You burned through millennia of stored energy in a few weeks because you remembered what it feels like to want something, and wanting costs." In the highest chamber, I knew Diana was watching. She had classified me as resolved, filed me in the drawer marked finished, and turned her attention to other matters. She had not checked on the graveyard since she dropped us in it. I delivered the filing. Effective immediately, the Leonardo Economic Group is executing a formal acquisition for the management rights of the Divine Realm. The bid is addressed to each divine entity individually, under Merchant Guild jurisdiction, the same legal framework that governed my acquisition of the Kingdom of Alban. Transaction consideration includes unlimited food, wine, and luxury goods. The bid closes at sunset. Payment begins now. I snapped my fingers. The item box opened. Not gold, not jewels. Chilled vintage wine by the thousand and cuts of dragon steak, so perfectly marinated that the scent alone would have started a war in the mortal world. Behind me, the delivery fleet launched. I had mapped every divine residence during the casino weeks. Every time a god redeemed winnings, Sylvia had logged the pickup coordinates. The fleet knew where every door was. Diana offered you clean silence, I said, raising a glass to the screen. I am offering lunch. The bottles dropped from the sky like rain, tens of thousands of them, launched from the item box in a single coordinated volley. One bottle shattered on the corridor floor. The scent of aged wine hit nostrils that had been dry for 10,000 years, and the last thread of divine composure snapped. A minor deity of mineral deposits, the kind of being who had spent millennia cataloging quartz formations, dropped to his knees and licked wine off the marble. The expression on his face was pure rapture, the kind of look a creature wears when it tastes sustenance for the first time in its existence. It spread like contagion. Corridor deities drank first, then plaza gods, then mid-rank authorities who had been pretending to maintain composure. One by one, they seized the bottles, tore into the steak, and pressed their acceptance seals against the acquisition notices attached to every delivery crate. The bid was addressed individually. That was the mechanism. Not to the Divine Council, not to Diana, to each god as a sovereign entity. Each god accepted independently because each god was individually starving, and the acceptance seal was the only thing standing between them and the next meal. Diana screamed for them to stop. Her voice carried the absolute authority of a goddess who had governed this realm without challenge for millennia. No one heard her. Sylvia updated the tally in real time from the graveyard. 30% within the first hour, 50 by the second. When Diana descended from the highest chamber to issue a countermand, the count was past 70, and the corridor floors were stained red with wine and slick with grease. The pristine realm of divine silence now smelled like a banquet hall after a 3-day feast. Gods stumbled between delivery crates, asking when the next shipment arrived. I watched the feed. You cannot sell water to a man who is not thirsty. That is the first lesson of commerce. The second lesson, if you need him thirsty, make him run. She found me in the council chamber. I had not requisitioned the room for its space. I had requisitioned it for its history. The chamber where divine order had been administered for 10,000 years now contained 46 delivery crates, stacked wine bottles, and a temporary desk with my signature pen on it. Diana knelt on the floor among broken glass. The corridor behind her, once a sanctuary of absolute silence, echoed with the sounds of gods feasting, arguing over vintages, and sleeping off their first meal in recorded eternity. Her golden wings hung motionless. The blindfold was still in place. The scales still rested in her left hand. Everything about her was identical to the moment she had dropped us into the graveyard. She demanded I reverse the acquisition. I told her the contracts were individually executed, individually sealed, and binding under Merchant Guild jurisdiction. The Guild's charter extended wherever commercial resource flows intersected with its articles. The Divine Realm's energy exchanges, fate distribution, weather allocation, harvest scheduling, qualified. She had never contested this because no one had ever tried. She threatened divine sanction. I pointed out, with what I hoped was the calm of a man reading terms and conditions, that her primary enforcement mechanism was the revocation of divine authority from disobedient entities, and that I now held the signed contracts of over 70% of her council. She could revoke their authority, but revoking it would trigger a breach of service clause in every contract simultaneously, transferring their remaining administrative functions directly to my organization as the aggrieved party. She could punish them, but punishing them would give me everything she was trying to protect. The scales did not move. The blindfold hid whatever was happening behind it. For the first time since I had entered the divine realm, Diana was silent in a way that was not authority. She told me to kill her, end the old order, and take her place. The words came out flat, the voice of a system requesting its own shutdown. No, I said. I offered her a handkerchief. She did not take it. Your world was clean, I said. Sterile. No bacteria, no infection, no impurity. But sterile rooms do not sustain living things. Your gods survived in stillness. The moment they started moving, the system failed. Not because your order was wrong, because it had no room for appetite. I gestured at the gods sleeping against the corridor walls outside. Full, warm, breathing, faces slack with the contentment of creatures who had just discovered what food was. They are more alive today than they have been in 10 millennia. You can hate what I did, but look at them, then remember what they looked like last week. The scales lowered, not to the floor, to her side. The posture of someone setting down a tool she had been holding too long. Chief Auditor, I said, full authority over every entity operating within the new governance structure. Contracts, resource allocation, service delivery, compliance. Any god, any merchant, any mortal subsidiary that breaches protocol answers to you. Complete enforcement power. The engine runs on desire. The brake runs on order. I need someone who treats order like oxygen. She was quiet long enough that I could hear wine being poured 3 corridors away. You are telling me, she said very slowly, that the chaos you created requires the one thing you destroyed. I am telling you that desire without structure is a fire. I started the fire. You keep it in the furnace. She asked about salary. The word came out stiff, a muscle being flexed for the first time. The highest in the organization, I said. You are the most important hire I will ever make. Her hand met mine. The grip was precise and reluctant, and exactly as strong as I had calculated. The handshake of a woman who had never negotiated from the employee side and intended to get the form right. The water god fell on the 4th hand. His name was Enlil, pure deity, governor of the eastern rainfall cycles. He had publicly called the casino an insult to divine rationality. When the fire god, who worked my tables, challenged him to a demonstration round, Enlil accepted the way a mathematician accepts a dare to solve a children's puzzle, with contempt and the absolute certainty that his intelligence made failure impossible. He sat down. Bet a sliver of divine energy. Cecilia dealt. King and 7, 17. Cecilia's open card was a 6. The probability said stand. Enlil stood. Cecilia drew a 5 and a queen, 21. The house won. Enlil stared at the table. For the first time in his existence, a prediction had been wrong. Again, he said. 2nd hand, lost. 3rd hand, lost. 4th hand, won. And on that 4th hand, something behind his eyes caught fire. The return of the chips. The confirmation that the pattern was real, that skill could master chance, that a mind built for governing rainfall could govern cards. The rush hit his nervous system like voltage through water. He stopped pretending he was here to prove a point. By the 8th round, he had wagered his administrative authority over the eastern rainfall. Double or nothing. He lost. Cecilia dealt the next hand before his expression finished changing. She was precise about that. The seamless continuation. The next card sliding across the felt before the mark had time to process what he had just surrendered. Her hands moved with the mechanical focus of a woman who had once commanded armies. 3 days later, Sylvia's report noted that the eastern rainfall had not been administered. The first unregulated rains in the demon world arrived gentle and unscheduled. Cecilia's homeland would grow crops for the first time in decades. I read the line, closed the folder, and felt the satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. The mathematics worked. They always did. The upper gods required a different instrument. They would not gamble on chance. They considered it beneath beings of their caliber. The art god, the record god, the concept gods, entities who had spent eternity cataloging beauty and truth. Blackjack was for lower minds. They said this while accepting the invitation to the private lounge I had built in the deepest recovered section of the graveyard. Velvet walls, leather sofas, music Sylvia had composed from fragments of mortal concert recordings. The atmosphere said, "You are special." That was the bait. I stood behind the bar counter and placed a stack of weathered parchment between the drinks. Ancient mortal poetry. Tragic love songs from a civilization that had died before most of these gods took their current posts. Beautiful, ambiguous, irresolvable. Interpretation poker, I said. Each stanza, you bet you're reading against the table. Did the protagonist choose death or choose to live with the suffering? Your aesthetic judgment is the chip. The table votes. Majority takes the pot. The art god declared his interpretation flawless. The record god said his archive was more accurate. They were competing before I finished dealing. The chips were not tokens. They were authority writs, governance rights over specific stars, trade winds, crop cycles, the luck distribution for entire civilizations. The upper gods wagered them the way aristocrats wager heirlooms, with the ironclad certainty that they would never actually lose, because losing would require someone in the room to have better taste. The arguments escalated. Voices rose. A debate about the ambiguity of a dead poet's final line became a war of pride, of record, of whose understanding of beauty was more complete. In the heat of intellectual combat, they forgot that every writ placed on the table was a legally binding transfer. Diana sat in the corner with the compliance ledger. She witnessed and notarized each contract. She did not intervene. Her role was enforcement of the rules as written. The gods had entered voluntarily. The contracts were valid. I caught Sylvia's eye across the room. The lower gods had fallen to appetite. The upper gods were falling to pride. Different bait, same hook. Commerce is not about what you sell. It is about understanding what the customer cannot refuse. By the end of the first evening, I held contractual authority over trade winds, crop cycles, and the luck distribution for 3 major civilizations. The gods left satisfied. They had enjoyed a stimulating evening of debate. They did not realize they had been gutted. The rebranding took less than a day. The divine energy I had accumulated, every wager won, every house edge percentage collected, every authority writ transferred, powered the transformation. White corridors became warm marble with gold inlay. Sterile plazas became gardens with fountains and actual flowers. An artificial sun and rotating starfield replaced the sourceless milky glow. Background music drifted through halls that had known nothing but silence. Not a casino anymore, a department store. The divine realms first: food halls, entertainment wings, luxury services, hospitality. Every god a customer, every transaction logged, every service contractually guaranteed and audited. I stood on the upper balcony. Below me, gods formed their first orderly queue. Diana stood at the entrance in a corporate blazer over her golden wings, compliance forms where her scales used to be, informing a war god that his purchase of 300 bottles exceeded his daily allocation. The war god filed an extension request without argument. Order still held. The mechanism had changed. Cecilia managed the supply chain from a corner office, watching her homeland's weather update in real time. Unregulated rainfall. The crops would grow. Sylvia coordinated logistics between the mortal production centers and the divine distribution network with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing this since before the gods knew they needed it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the copper coin, battered, scratched. The first coin I had ever earned, back when I was a porter oiling someone else's equipment at 4 in the morning. I held it up against the artificial sun, and it caught the light better than gold. 1 coin, 1 ledger, 1 man who decided that the entire world was inventory waiting to be priced. The supply chain now connected mortal production, demon agriculture, and divine consumption into a single closed system. An economy that started with a copper coin in a dungeon now governed the flow of weather, luck, and harvest across civilizations. I flipped the coin, caught it, put it back. There was no celebration. There was always work to do. But for the first time since I entered the divine realm, the work ahead was expansion, not survival. Opening hours begin tomorrow, I said. Make sure the shelves are stocked. Sylvia was writing the schedule before I finished the sentence. That was the job, not because anyone noticed, but because it was the kind of thing that mattered exactly when it stopped getting done. The department store opened on a Tuesday, or what passed for a Tuesday in a realm that had never needed a calendar. I gave them one, because if I was going to run a commercial operation in heaven, I was going to run it properly. The building was the old administrative complex, gutted floor by floor after the conquest. Ground level became a food court. The meditation hall where gods had sat in silence for 10,000 years now smelled like dragon steak and dwarf-fried tempura and elven pastries so precise they looked like jewels. The casino moved from the graveyard to the 5th floor. Same games, new marble, 3 times the revenue. The rooftop became a garden with paid seating, because even peace of mind has overhead costs. I stood at the window above it all and watched the monitors. Gods queuing at ramen counters on the ground floor. arguing over seasoning they had never tasted before this month. Gods debating slot odds on 5. Gods paying by the hour to sit in the rooftop garden and feel a breeze on skin that had not registered temperature in millennia. First quarter revenue exceeded every projection. Customer traffic had been dense from the opening hour and had not dropped. Average spend per deity was climbing weekly. This week, it was imported wine. Next week, it would be clothing. The week after that, someone would discover furniture, and I would need to double the home goods floor space. I wrote a note about expanding rooftop seating, closed the ledger, poured a glass from a dwarven distiller's vendor sample. The divine realm was a functioning economy, not because the gods had changed, because desire, once switched on, does not switch off. The casino had been the match. The department store was the furnace. That was the most satisfying view in any world I had visited. It also meant I was restless, because comfortable was not a state I stayed in for long. Diana found Mars before I did. The war god had been working security on the casino floor, a natural assignment for someone whose entire divine portfolio was hitting things. The problem was calibration. A customer lost at the slots, threw a tantrum, and spat on the floor near Mars's boots. Mars removed the customer from the premises physically. The grip left a bruise that healed in 3 seconds because the customer was also a god, but the principle was the violation, not the duration of the injury. Diana was waiting at the end of the corridor when Mars came off shift. Golden binder in one hand, pen in the other, corporate blazer buttoned over wings that still caught the chandelier light. She informed him that his handling constituted excessive force under Chapter 8, Section 3 of the Employee Conduct Manual. She quoted the subsection about de-escalation. The prescribed response to an agitated customer was a glass of cold water, a re-entry coupon, and a smile, not a palm strike that dented the marble behind the customer's head. Mars tried to explain that the customer had spat on him. Diana asked him whether he was a god or a bouncer who could not tolerate saliva. She docked 10% of his pay and assigned 3 hours of customer service retraining in the back office. He slumped against the wall the way a man does. After losing a war, he did not realize he was fighting. She was not finished. The commerce god, the one who managed slot probability settings, had quietly adjusted the house edge on the 3rd floor machines by 0.5% without authorization. Not enough for any single customer to notice. Enough over a quarter to skim a margin that appeared in no official report. Diana corrected him with the same voice she had once used to restructure divine law. 100 written pages of incident documentation. A full audit of every machine he had touched. A week of restroom cleaning across all floors. Both reports arrived on my desk that afternoon. I countersigned them and put them in the employee incident folder. Her analysis was flawless. Her enforcement was proportional. The instinct for finding where rules bent was the same instinct that had governed cosmic order for millennia. She had simply pointed it at a smaller target. She had chosen the office next to mine. Neither of us commented on that. Ethan arrived on a reward trip he had not requested. His road crew, the northern highway connecting the outer settlements to the capital supply line, had finished 6 days ahead of schedule. Company merit policy awarded any team that beat its deadline by more than 3 days a 2-night pass to the Divine Department Store. Ethan qualified on the numbers. I did not make exceptions in either direction. He came through the front entrance with his site crew, 3 workers and a foreman, all sunburned, all stunned by the golden building in front of them. Ethan looked different. 3 years of honest labor had replaced the old arrogance with something leaner. His hair was shorter. His hands were calloused where the tools went, not where the sword had rested. He moved like a man who had learned what his body could do without magic and had made peace with the answer. His crew scattered through the food court. Ethan stayed near the edge, scanning the room the way he used to scan dungeon corridors. Except now, he was looking for a place to sit. He found a small counter near the back wall, a polished wooden bar, 8 seats, no line, a cloth curtain with hand-brush lettering. The chef was enormous, shoulders built for siege warfare, hands that could crush stone, working a slender knife with the precision of a jeweler. He wore a white coat, but the energy rolling off him was unmistakable. a war god, an old one, the patron of a civilization that no longer existed, whose worshippers had been dust for longer than most kingdoms had histories. When the department store opened, he had walked out of the graveyard and asked for a kitchen. Ethan sat down, recognized the god. The god recognized him back, the mortal he had once sent a holy blade to in a dream, years and a lifetime ago. He told Ethan the sword days were finished and to call him chef. What followed was not a meal. It was a sequence of small, perfect things placed one at a time in front of a man who had spent 3 years eating field rations. The first piece was tuna. The cut was so precise, the fish held its shape on the rice like a living thing that had simply chosen to rest there. The knife work was combat technique, centuries of battlefield timing repurposed into something that fed people instead of ending them. Ethan put it in his mouth and went still. He did not speak for the next 40 minutes. Piece after piece, salmon, sea bream, sweet shrimp that dissolved on contact, a seared cut so delicate it seemed impossible the same hands had once directed armies. Ethan ate each one with the focus of a man encountering something he did not have the vocabulary for. When the last piece was gone, he sat at the empty counter for a long time, tipped more than the meal cost, came back the next night for a second sitting. The part that stayed with me, reviewing the security feed later, was not the food. It was the expression on Ethan's face between courses. Not awe, not hunger. The quiet confusion of a man realizing that excellence does not require an audience, a rank, or a quest. It requires the right thing to care about and enough time to get it right. I did not know then that this visit would quietly destabilize the vow Ethan had been building his life around. I only knew he left the divine realm walking lighter than he had arrived. Garrett started his morning before the sun cleared the ridge. The staging depot was a cleared plateau in the mountain corridor between the surface world and the divine gate. Containers stacked and tagged in the pre-dawn dark, 50 tons of northern salmon in cold storage crates, high-altitude vegetables from the Demon World's agricultural zones, premium produce from surface farms. The Demon World shipments came from land that had been barren when Cecilia signed her contract 3 years ago. Now it grew enough to feed heaven. Garrett stood at the center of the loading yard in dark blue coveralls and hard hat, bullhorn in one hand, clipboard in the other. His crew, a dozen orcs in cold weather gear, breath visible, moved around him with the precision of a team that had stopped needing instructions months ago. Every container had a temperature tag. Every tag had a routing code. Nothing was improvised. The express courier for the divine leg was a dragon named Ignir, 50 meters of red scales and ancient fire, a creature that had once been capable of ending civilizations with a single breath. He landed at the depot every morning at the same time, folded his wings with the deliberateness of a man parking his truck, and asked what the cargo was. Garrett told him, salmon, 50 tons, temperature sensitive, 90-minute delivery window. He reminded the dragon, as he did every morning, that body heat cooking the fish in transit activated the penalty clause. Ignir's response was a low rumble of professional offense. He had never missed a temperature window. His payment was waiting. A crate of premium marbled beef, the highest grade the network produced. Garrett had negotiated the contract himself after learning what the dragon actually valued. Not gold, not territory, excellent food, delivered consistently from someone who treated the exchange as a professional transaction between equals. The crew locked the cold storage containers into the custom harness on the dragon's back, checked balance, confirmed the flight route. Ignir launched. The mountain trembled. Garrett watched the red shape shrink against the gray sky and spoke the confirmation number into his radio. 20 minutes ahead of schedule. He wrote it in the route log and started prepping the afternoon shipment. The salmon was still cold when it hit the dock. I came down to review the delivery log. Garrett handed it over without ceremony. Every line filled, every timestamp inside the window. The fish went to the food court vendors. The vegetables went to the prepared meals kitchen. The premium cuts went to cold storage for the rotating menu. 3 years of this route and Garrett had never delivered late, never lost a crate, never had a temperature breach. The dragon had never missed a window either. 2 professionals doing their work the same way every morning. And the result was that a department store in heaven served fresh sushi because someone woke up before dawn to make sure it would. Cecilia's people were eating. That was the line I kept returning to. The Demon World's farms, the ones she had bargained for when she agreed to terms that cost her independence, were producing at full capacity. Garrett's route connected those farms to the Divine Realm's tables. An ancient dragon carried food across a dimensional boundary because an orc had offered him beef and professional respect, and that was enough. I handed the log back. Garrett tucked it under his arm and went to check tomorrow's routing. Back in my office, I opened the expansion file. 12 more chairs for the rooftop, a second wine supplier, a dedicated seafood counter for the sushi chef, whose wait list backed up into the main corridor every evening. I wrote the orders, closed the file. The system was running, every person doing the thing they were best at, every piece in the right place. And the thing about a system that works is that nobody notices it. Nobody sees the temperature logs, nobody notices the delivery schedule, nobody connects the fresh fish on their plate to the orc and the dragon who were awake before dawn. Nobody notices. That is how you know it is working. Sylvia triple-checked the numbers before she brought them to me. That was the tell. She never checked twice. 3 meant the data was bad enough that she wanted to be wrong, and she was not wrong, and she knew it before she opened her mouth. Northern Depot, she said. Her tablet was pressed flat against her chest instead of held out for me to read. Lumera region, grain and basic medical stock. She set the screen on my desk and stepped back. Sales have stopped, not declined, not slowed. 0 transactions for 11 consecutive days. The wheat is spoiling in the warehouse. The potions have exceeded their shelf window. I set my coffee down without drinking it. Lumera was a mining district in the northern reaches. Cold, poor, the kind of place where winter lasted 8 months, and a bag of flour was the difference between a household that survived and one that did not. They had been buying from us steadily since the supply chain reached them. 11 days of 0 was not a market correction, it was an amputation. Pull Ethan in, I said. His mother lives there. He came through the teleport gate 10 minutes later, still wearing his hard hat, dust on his sleeves from the tunnel project in the south. He looked like a man pulled mid-swing. What happened? He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Sylvia said emergency. Your mother wrote to you recently. His expression shifted. Not alarm, something quieter. The reflex of a man who had not thought about his mother's address in a professional context before and was suddenly being asked to. She writes every month. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a creased envelope, the kind that gets carried but never discarded, read once and then kept near the body because throwing it away felt worse than the weight of it. He scanned the page and read the relevant line aloud. His mother thanking him for the money he had been sending, telling him the money was no longer needed. A barefoot saint had appeared in Lumera. The woman prayed, and bread appeared. She prayed again, and the sick were healed. No cost, no contract, no purchase. She sounded happy, Ethan said. He said it the way a man offers something fragile, unsure if the room will let him hold it. I did not answer that. I pulled up the remote viewing feed. Cecilia's scrying network covered most of the continent, and Lumera was inside the range. The image materialized above my desk, a wide shot of the town square. What I saw was not a town. It was a waiting room. The market stalls were shuttered. The workshops were dark. At the center of the square, a single figure stood on a mound of conjured bread, staff in hand, distributing food to a line of people who took what was given and walked away in silence. No coins changed hands. No words were exchanged. The transactions, if you could call them that, had the mechanical rhythm of feeding time at a kennel. Ethan stared at the image. His childhood friend was visible near the old forge, sitting on the ground outside, hands thin. The muscle of a former blacksmith melted to nothing. That is not rescue, I said. That is feeding a cage. I grabbed my jacket, told Sylvia to hold the schedule, told Ethan to come with me, because it was his mother's town, and he deserved to see it with his own eyes before I did what I was going to do about it. He hesitated. His hand tightened on the letter. I opened the teleport gate. I did not wait for him to decide. He followed anyway. The teleport gate dropped us into mud. I noticed the silence before the smell. A town of several thousand people should have sounded like something. Hammers on iron, carts on stone, the low competitive shouting of merchants pricing against each other. Lumera was a mining district. The air should have tasted like coal dust and effort. Instead, there was nothing. A wet, organic stillness. The sound of people breathing and waiting and doing absolutely nothing else. The market quarter was intact, tools on their pegs, goods behind shuttered windows. I could see the anvils through gaps in the forge doors, gathering the kind of dust that only forms when a hand has not touched the surface in weeks. The bakery ovens were cold. The grain merchant's counter was untouched. People sat on steps, on the ground, outside their own homes, as if the concept of going inside and doing something had become foreign. They were not sleeping. They were not talking to each other. They were waiting with the blank patience of animals who know the next feeding is coming and have forgotten there was ever anything to do between meals. Ethan walked beside me and said nothing. His jaw was locked. His eyes kept drifting 2 streets east, where his mother's door would be. He did not turn toward it. Not yet. I stopped in front of the shuttered forge. Through the gap, I saw the blacksmith's bench, iron stock still in the rack, tongs hanging. The last piece the man had been working on still clamped in the vise, half-shaped, abandoned at the exact moment he had decided there was no longer a reason to finish it. "This is wrong," Ethan said, quietly, like he was not sure he had the right to say it in his own hometown. I kept walking toward the square. She was smaller than I expected. Elena stood on a pile of bread that should not have existed, loaf after loaf, stacked waist-high, still warm. She held a thin wooden staff and wore a rough linen dress that hung on her frame like it had been sewn for someone with more weight on her bones. No shoes. Her skin was translucent. I could see the veins in her wrists from 20 paces away. She was burning through something deeper than stamina to produce all of this, and the cost was written on her body in a script I could read but not yet translate. The townspeople lined up. They took the bread. They accepted the healing she offered. A touch of her staff, a pale glow, the wound or illness simply gone. No payment, no conversation. They received and they left, with the mechanical certainty of people collecting a ration they had been promised. I approached her directly. She knew who I was before I reached her. Word travels fast in small places, and I was wearing a tailored suit in a square full of mud. I might as well have arrived carrying a banner. I told her what her system was doing. No malice, no theater. I laid it out the way I would present a quarterly projection to a board that needed the worst-case version first. Her free supply had collapsed the local market. Every farmer, baker, and herbalist in Lumera was out of work, not because they had been outcompeted, but because you cannot compete with free. The forges were cold, the ovens were dark. When her bread stopped, and it would stop, nobody here would remember how to earn their own. She was not feeding them. She was teaching them to forget. She listened with the soft certainty of someone who has already decided the conversation is over before it begins. Then she told me people were suffering now, not in a projection, not in a future quarter, now. And suffering was not a market inefficiency to be optimized with better pricing. I told her dignity was not something you hand someone wrapped in bread, that a man who earns his meal owns something a man who receives it never will, that she was dissolving the only thing these people had that was actually theirs, the ability to provide for themselves. She told me she had never heard someone weigh the worth of a meal and find it wanting. I tried one more thing. I offered her a contract, a position in my company, a real salary, enough to buy bread for the entire region without destroying the economy that produced the bread. I held out a gold coin, the highest denomination piece my company minted, enough to sustain a household for 3 months. She recoiled, physically, as if I had held out a poisonous thing. She called it corrupted. She called it a chain forged from greed. The fear in her voice was genuine and absolute. And I understood then that I was not dealing with a strategist or a rival. I was dealing with someone who believed, to the marrow of her bones, that money itself was evil. The crowd had been thickening behind her since I arrived. Several hundred people now. The air changed the way it changes in any room when a group of humans decides together that someone does not belong. The first stone was dried mud, small. It hit my shoulder and crumbled. The second was not mud. Then the air filled. I stopped counting after the third or fourth because the crowd had become a single animal and the animal had made its decision. They were not soldiers. They were not coordinated. They were frightened people defending the only thing that had ever been given to them for nothing. And I was the man who had walked into their square and told them it was poison. Ethan stepped in front of me. A stone caught his shoulder and he did not flinch. His body knew before his brain did. 3 years of construction sites had welded the reflex into his spine. You see danger, you put yourself between it and whoever is standing behind you. That was what his hands knew how to do, and in that moment, I was the one standing behind him. Then a voice, not shouting, carrying. The kind of voice that fills a square because every other sound makes room for it. Ethan's mother. She was not throwing stones. She stood at the back edge of the crowd with her hands at her sides, and she was asking her son a question. Why was he standing with the man who charged for bread? Why was he protecting the merchant who put a price on medicine that the saint gave freely? Her neighbors were eating. Her neighbors were healed. And her son, who she had told everyone about. Her son, the builder. Her son who sent money home every month. Her son was standing in front of the man who wanted to take all of it away. The square went silent, not peace. The silence of several hundred people holding their breath to hear what the boy would say to his mother. Ethan looked at her. I watched his face and saw something I had only seen once before. In my own reflection, the morning I was dismissed from the party. The expression of a man who has just been told that the thing he built his identity around is the wrong thing by the one person whose judgment he cannot dismiss. I did not tell him what to do. I did not touch his arm. He turned from her, walked with me toward the teleport gate. Mud and stones hit his back, and he did not flinch. But his hands were shaking, and the tremor had nothing to do with cold. The gate closed behind us. Through the shimmer, in the last instant before it sealed, I saw Elena kneeling beside his mother, one arm around the old woman's shoulders, whispering into her ear, comforting her, claiming her. That image stayed. The footage spread within 2 days. Someone in the crowd had been recording. The version that circulated showed me speaking and the crowd reacting, the argument, the stones, the retreat. What it did not show was the cold forges, the shuttered market, the blacksmith's unfinished iron still clamped in the vise. No editing was required. The crowd had filmed what they experienced, and what they experienced was a rich man arguing with a saint and losing. The narrative was simple because reality is always too complicated for a headline. A merchant tried to take free bread from starving people. That was the story. The fact that the free bread was dissolving the town's ability to function was not the kind of detail that survives compression into a slogan. The Divine Department Store's ground-level entrances were picketed by the third day, signs visible from my office window. The lower floors stayed operational because the gods did not follow mortal news feeds, and Divine Realm revenue was unaffected. But the human world contracts were bleeding. 12 cancellations in the first week. The stated reasons were neutral: restructuring, revised procurement, seasonal adjustment. The real reason was that no client wanted their name next to mine on a page right now. Sylvia handled every cancellation personally. She processed each one with the same precision she used for purchase orders. Calm, exact, no wasted syllable. Her scheduling matrix adapted within the hour to every lost contract. She did not ask me if we should issue a public response. She did not ask me if I was all right. She filed and rerouted and absorbed because that was the job. And the job was the only structure still standing while the walls took hits. I reviewed the damage at the end of the week. Manageable. The core was holding. The Divine Realm was untouched. The Demon World supply chain ran clean. I instructed the company to continue operations without adjustment. No price changes, no public statements, no retreat. The window behind my desk had a crack in it from a stone that had reached the top floor. Sylvia had scheduled the repair. I told her to leave it. The crack was useful. It reminded me, every time I looked through it, that I had been right in Lumera, and that being right had cost me a window, a dozen contracts, and something I had not yet finished calculating. He knocked. That was the first wrong thing. Ethan had not knocked on my office door in 2 years. He walked in mid-sentence. He dropped budget disputes on my desk while I was still reading the last one. He argued about overtime in a voice that filled the hallway. The knock meant the conversation was already finished, and what came next was the formality of saying it aloud. He was not wearing his hard hat, not wearing work boots. The clothes were soft and plain, the quietest things in his closet, chosen because he did not want to perform anything today. No company badge around his neck. Leo. He stood in front of my desk. He did not sit. I opened the drawer. The envelope was already there. I had placed it inside 3 days ago, the morning after Lumera, because I am a merchant and merchants calculate outcomes before they arrive. Inside was enough to sustain his mother's household for the rest of her natural life without Elena's bread or anyone else's charity. I slid it across the desk. He did not look at it. I am resigning, he said. Effective now. The envelope is your severance. More than fair. He shook his head. a small motion, like even the gesture cost him something he could not afford. I do not want it. His voice cracked on the last word, and he stopped to breathe. When he started again, the crack was gone, plastered over with the blunt discipline that had carried him through 3 years of trench work and road building, and learning to be proud of calluses instead of kill counts. The money was dirty, he told me, not because I had stolen it, not because the company was corrupt, because he could not hold a single coin without hearing his mother's voice in that square, asking him why he was standing on the wrong side. Every coin had her face on it now, and he could not spend that. He could not save it. He could not look at it and pretend Lumera had not happened. He did not say I was wrong. He did not say I was right. He said he could not keep building roads and signing invoices and sitting in the company canteen as if his mother had not stood in the mud and asked him to come home. I sat behind my desk and did not argue. I did not offer a leave of absence. I did not restructure the conversation into something I could solve with a contract amendment. I had calculated this outcome 3 days ago and decided what I would do when it arrived. What I would do was nothing. Ethan was not making a business decision. He was making the only decision a man with his wound could make, and nothing in my drawer could dress it. Go, I said. He placed his employee badge on the desk, turned, walked to the door. His hand rested on the handle a moment longer than it needed to, long enough that I understood he was giving me a window to stop him, and I was choosing not to climb through it. The door closed. I picked up the badge, his photograph, hard hat, sunburn, the wide grin of a man who had discovered that building a road with his own hands felt better than clearing a dungeon with borrowed magic. The envelope sat on the desk, untouched. That was the part that stayed with me, not the resignation, not the door closing. The money, still in its envelope, perfectly calculated, completely useless. I had built everything I owned on the principle that the right price solves the problem. Ethan had just handed me the first problem it could not reach. I put the badge in the top drawer next to the envelope and closed it. Outside, the chanting continued. The crack in the window caught the last of the afternoon light and drew a thin, bright line across my hands. The hearth was dead. I had not asked anyone to relight it. Sylvia set the coffee down without commentary and waited while I arranged what the supply runner had brought me. 2 items on the desk, centered in the lamp's circle. A loaf of Elena's bread, dense, pale, the miracle food that made her followers weep with gratitude, and a fistful of Lumera soil sealed in a glass jar. The bread looked normal. I turned it under the lamp and studied the cross-section through a loupe. Roughly 300 calories per loaf. She distributed tens of thousands daily. Her personal mana reserves should have emptied in the first few hours of the first day. She had been producing for over a month. The numbers do not work, I said. Sylvia leaned against the filing cabinet. She had not gone home since Ethan left. Neither had I. Outside, the siege had settled into its rhythm. Chanting by day, silence by night. The occasional stone against a window nobody bothered replacing. Her followers call it a divine miracle, she said. The goddess is sitting in the corner of this room on most nights. I glanced at Diana's usual spot, empty tonight. It is not divine. I picked up the glass jar. The soil inside was white, not gray, not faded, bone white, powder fine. This had been farmland, black, rich, the kind of topsoil that held centuries of accumulated mineral density. Now it crumbled to nothing between my fingers. I need you to analyze both, I said. Not nutritional content, mana signature, where the energy came from. What reservoir is paying for this? Her posture shifted. She straightened the way she always did when a task moved from administrative to personal. She had been an ice mage before she was a secretary. Materials analysis was inside her range. She placed one hand over the bread, closed her eyes. 4 seconds of silence. When she opened her eyes, her face had lost all color. She pulled her hand back as if the loaf had bitten her. This mana is old. Her voice was flat in a way I had not heard before. Not atmospheric, not gathered from the ambient field. It has been buried for hundreds of years, possibly thousands. Deep geological mana, heavy, cold, the kind that accumulates in bedrock over epochs. And the soil. She touched the jar. This time, she flinched before she even closed her eyes. Depleted, completely. The mineral structure reads like a desert that has been dead for centuries, except this sample was alive weeks ago. She set the jar down carefully. The mana was extracted, forcibly. The soil is the husk. I crushed a pinch of the white powder between my fingers. It dissolved into dust and drifted down through the lamplight. "She is drawing on the planet's life force," I said. "The ley lines beneath Lumira, geological mana that took millennia to accumulate. Every loaf she conjures drains decades of stored energy from the land itself." Sylvia was quiet for a long time. "The cold," she said finally. "The crop failures. The wells drying up. All symptoms. She is burning the Earth's reserves and calling it generosity." I stood. "This is not charity. This is embezzlement. Spending future centuries of fertility to fund 1 month of free bread. When the reserves hit zero, the production stops, and Lumera becomes a wasteland that will not recover in our lifetimes. Will she stop? She does not know what she is drawing from. She experiences it as limitless capacity." I pulled a fresh sheet of parchment from the drawer. "She will not stop until she collapses, and by then, the damage will be irreversible." I began writing. Not a letter, not a protest, a procurement order. Sylvia's analysis gave me the decay curve, how fast the geological mana was draining, how much remained, and when the production threshold would collapse. The math was not complicated. Elena had weeks, not months. The question was, what happened to Lumera when the bread stopped? The answer was famine. The soil was already dead. Normal crops would not grow. The wells were dry. The workshops were shuttered because nobody had worked in over a month. There was no stored food because Elena's system had made storage unnecessary. When her supply failed, there would be nothing between those people and starvation except whatever I could put in front of them before the panic turned lethal. I needed grain that could grow in depleted soil, grain that did not require the mineral density Elena had burned through. Black wheat, demon world variety, cultivated in volcanic soil by Cecilia's people, heat-resistant, drought-resistant, capable of germinating in conditions that would kill any human world crop. The shells were hard, and the taste was somewhere between charcoal and regret, but it was calorie-dense, and it was available. I dispatched 6 purchasing agents before dawn, spread across different demon world markets, each buying independently, so no single transaction spiked the price. By sunrise, I had secured the entire available supply of black wheat in the southern agricultural zone. The sellers did not know why. They did not need to. Sylvia handled the logistics paperwork while I built the distribution plan. Field distribution kits, a portable medical unit with refeeding protocols, because a starving population that suddenly receives food needs supervision, or the refeeding itself becomes lethal. And labor contracts, pre-drafted, standard terms from our existing employment framework, wages, housing, 90-day notice clauses, dignity provisions. I had written into every contract since the company's founding. A worker who cannot quit is not an employee. He is inventory. "The overland route is blocked," Sylvia said, without looking up from her forms. "Elena's divine barrier covers the entire northern territory. Our transports trigger the purification field the moment they cross the perimeter." I knew. I had already ruled out air, ground, and teleportation. "There is one route," I said, 12,000 meters below the surface, a magma corridor that runs beneath the barrier's lowest boundary. Her pen stopped. "You are sending a convoy through a magma tunnel." "I am sending Garrett through a magma tunnel with 50 trucks." She resumed writing. If she had an opinion about the sanity of the plan, she filed it in the same place she filed every other objection she chose not to voice. I picked up the communication crystal and called the transport division. The corridor was hot enough to cook flesh in minutes without shielding. Garrett had known that before he agreed to the run. He had researched the passage 2 weeks ahead of departure. Geological surveys, known inhabitants, thermal tolerance thresholds for every component of his vehicles. By the time I gave the order, he had already submitted the modification requests: refrigerated cargo holds, heat-resistant axle casings, emergency coolant reserves bolted to the exterior of every truck, 50 vehicles, single file. The corridor was too narrow for anything wider than 1 lane. Below the road surface, if the cracked basalt shelf they were driving on qualified as a road, the magma churned in slow orange currents, close enough that the tires left smoke trails on the stone. I tracked the convoy from my office through relay crystals Garrett had planted at intervals along the route. His voice came through clipped and steady, the way it always did when conditions were at their worst. The third truck's coolant failed within the first hour. Engine temperature spiked past the operational ceiling. Garrett ordered the crew to cut the engine, lock the wheels, and push. 4 orc engineers braced against the rear panel and shoved an armored truck loaded with black wheat through a tunnel of fire. Their hands were wrapped in wet canvas that dried and smoked within seconds. They pushed for 40 minutes. When the coolant system cycled back online, they climbed into the cab and drove. Nobody filed a complaint. Nobody asked to turn back. The 6th hour was the Dragon. It announced itself with a pressure wave that blew the dust off every dashboard in the convoy. The basalt ahead glowed white instead of orange, and through the relay crystal, I saw it. A fire drake, juvenile by proportion, but still large enough to block the corridor wall to wall. Its body was coiled across the road like a barricade, scales pulsing with heat that made the air ripple. Garrett pulled the convoy to a halt at regulation distance. He stepped out of the lead truck and walked forward carrying a crate. Inside was 200 pounds of premium Demon World beef, aged, marbled, the kind Cecilia's ranchers reserved for high-end trade. Garrett had packed it before departure because the geological survey listed a fire drake den at this depth, and fire drakes were territorial carnivores with a documented preference for red meat. He set the crate down, opened the lid, stepped back. The drake's nostrils flared. Its head swung toward the beef. It ate methodically, without rush, the way a predator eats when it is not threatened. When the crate was empty, it uncoiled and slithered into a side fissure, its tail dragging a groove in the basalt. Garrett walked back to the lead truck, keyed the convoy forward. "Obstacle cleared," he said through the relay. Resuming standard spacing, 50 trucks moved through the gap. The walls still radiated white heat. Behind them, the fissure sealed with a fresh flow of magma, closing the corridor they had just passed through. No way back, only forward. Garrett did not mention it. Elena's morning distribution started the way it always did. Staff raised, light gathering at the tip. The crowd pressed forward with the numb patience of people who had forgotten what it felt like to feed themselves. The bread that materialized was thin. I had projected this from Sylvia's depletion curve. Each loaf's energy density would decline as the geological reserves approached their floor. The followers would not notice at first. They would eat bread that filled their stomachs, but not their bodies. They would grow weaker while believing they were sustained. Elena's skin had gone from translucent to gray. The veins I had noticed weeks ago were now visible across the relay feed, dark lines mapping her arms and throat like cracks in old porcelain. She was supplementing. The soil reserves had dropped below the threshold where her magic could route cleanly through the ley lines, so she was feeding her own biological energy into the gap, burning herself to maintain output. She had been doing this for 2 days. I knew because the depletion curve predicted the crossover point, and she had not stopped producing. The last batch was not bread, it was mud. Black, wet, formless. The raw material of a spell that no longer had the energy to complete itself. It splattered across the cobblestones. A child in the front row caught it across the chest. Elena stared at her staff. Her lips moved. Nothing came. She dropped to her knees, then forward, face against the stone, unconscious before the crowd understood what had happened. 3 seconds of silence. Then the square broke open. Shouts first, confused, then angry, then animal. The people who had been fed for free now stood in a dead square with no food, no crops, no stored supplies, and no one left to give them anything. The patient lines dissolved. The gentle shuffling rhythm of the daily distribution evaporated in the time it took Elena's body to hit the ground. I watched through the relay crystal and checked Garrett's position. 11 minutes out. The ground split at the eastern edge of the square, not cleanly. It was a detonation of stone and steam. The basalt shelf above the magma corridor giving way to 50 armored vehicles that had drilled their final few hundred meters vertically. The lead truck erupted through the cobblestones, trailing sulfur vapor and radiating so much residual heat that the frost on the nearest market stall evaporated on contact. Garrett was standing in the open hatch before the vehicle fully stopped. Behind him, the rest of the convoy surfaced one by one, each truck venting compressed air as its cargo hold locks released. The crowd had been surging toward Elena's unconscious body. Now they froze. I stepped out of the second vehicle. The cold hit immediately. Summer in Lumera felt like deep winter now, another symptom of the depleted ley lines. But the trucks radiated enough residual corridor heat to cut a warm channel through the square. 50 black trucks bearing the company seal, parked in a crater of broken stone and sulfur steam. Nobody moved. I walked to the lead truck and opened the cargo hold. Black wheat, 50 tons across the full convoy, plus refrigerated produce from the Demon World markets, plus a field medical unit with refeeding protocols and 3 trained medics. Distribute, I told Garrett. His crew moved, tables materialized, grain sacks were cut open. The first loaves, baked in the cargo holds during transit, dense and dark and hard enough to chip a tooth, were stacked and ready within minutes. The medics set up a triage line for the worst cases, the ones whose bodies had been consuming themselves for days, while Elena's hollow bread convinced their stomachs they were full. I gave the first round away, free, no contract, no signature, no terms. Bread into hands, medical assessment for anyone who could not stand. Water from the reserves we had carried through 12,000 meters of fire. Starving people cannot read contracts. I had always known this. The sequencing was not generosity. It was operational common sense. When the immediate distribution stabilized, when the shaking hands held bread and the worst cases were on refeeding drips and the crowd's breathing had slowed from panic to exhaustion, I set up a table near the eastern wall of the square. Labor contracts, standard terms across every zone I operated. Wages, housing allocation, 90-day notice clause, meaning anyone who signed could leave with 3 months warning and no penalty. The work was real, rebuilding infrastructure, restoring the mines, laying roads, hard labor, paid labor. I told them the emergency food was free. I told them the ongoing supply was employment. I told them nothing was free and everyone survives. Some of Elena's followers helped distribute bread. I had not asked them to. They moved into the line because the line needed bodies and they were standing closest. One by one, people signed. Not gratefully, not willingly. They signed with the expression of people choosing the least terrible option, which was exactly what a contract was. Elena had regained consciousness. She was sitting against a market stall post where she had fallen, too weak to stand. Her attendants had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Her staff lay on the ground beside her, inert. Around her, the people she had fed for weeks were lined up at my tables instead of hers. I walked over, not fast, not slow, the pace of a man completing a task. She looked up at me with eyes that had been emptied of everything except comprehension. She understood now, the mud, the collapse, the dead soil. She might not have known the mechanism, might never have grasped that her production magic was routing through the ley lines, but she saw the result. Her miracle had broken the land it was supposed to save. She whispered something, a request to be punished, the simplicity of an ending. No, I said. I placed a contract on her lap. You owe these people decades of fertility that your magic stripped from their soil. You have a rare capacity that, used correctly under controlled limits, has genuine value. You will work in the company's medical division, healing services, sustainable output, no more draining what is beneath you. Her hands shook on the parchment. This is not forgiveness, I said. This is an invoice. She signed the next morning when the medics cleared her to hold a pen. I had a notary on site. I stood in the square after the contracts were filed and the distribution lines were running and the medical team was rotating through the critical cases. Garrett directed the unloading of the last trucks, his soot-blackened jumpsuit still radiating heat. Sylvia, who had arrived through the conventional route once the barrier weakened with Elena's collapse, cataloged signatures and filed employment records with the efficiency of someone who had never once left a form incomplete. The bread from the convoy was terrible, hard and black and gritty, with a taste somewhere between charcoal and ash. I bit into a piece and chewed slowly. It was real. It would not vanish when the magic ran out. It tasted like what it cost, and what it cost was honest. The overcast sky showed no sign of clearing. The cold would last for months while the ley lines recovered. The soil would need years of rehabilitation. The people would need to relearn how to work, how to earn, how to live inside a system that charged for what it provided. Nothing was free. Everyone survived. I swallowed the bread and went back to work. 1 month. The hammers started before dawn and did not stop until the shift bell rang at dusk. I stood on the factory roof and listened to the rhythm, iron on iron, the grind of heavy rollers in the grain processing wing, the dull thud of crates being stacked at the loading dock. Sounds I had heard in every territory I had built. The template was the same, only the soil was different. Lumera was unrecognizable. The convoy had carried more than grain. It carried prefabricated workshop frames, portable smelting rigs, tooling kits, and a 40-person management team trained in the standard deployment protocol. The empty market stalls were active workshops now. The roads Ethan's crew had graded months ago carried flatbed trucks hauling finished goods to the southern trade route. A textile mill employed 200. The grain depot ran 3 shifts. The break room served the same menu every day: black wheat bread and dried meat broth. Nobody called it delicious. Nobody called it a miracle. It was food that tasted like what it cost, and the people who ate it had earned the coins to pay for it. The site foreman, the same man who had once stood in Elena's breadline with hollow eyes, was running a crew of 30 with a voice that carried across the floor. His mother worked the canteen. She told him, between ladles, that bread you buy with your own wages has a flavor that free bread never did. He laughed and bit into a piece with muddy hands. The branch manager's monthly report sat on my lap. Output numbers, employment figures, payroll, soil recovery projections. Every line improved except the last one. The ley line depletion was stable, not worsening, not recovering. Cecilia's black wheat grew in dead earth the way it grew in volcanic rock, buying time that the planet had not earned back. The rehabilitation timeline was measured in decades. I wrote 2 notes in the margin: expand the northern road to connect the mine, review the soil data at 60 days. I turned the page to the next region. The report was satisfactory. The town was alive. It did not feel the way winning usually felt. Something that was not in the ledger was not balanced, and I could not have named it, so I did not try. The medical center closed at 6. Elena stayed. Her last patient of the day had been a noblewoman from a distant province. Chronic bone deterioration, years without relief. Elena resolved it in a single session. The woman wept. Elena handed her an invoice. The woman paid. Elena placed the coins in the lockbox and closed the lid. That was the new rhythm. Patients came. She healed them. She charged what the contract specified. The gold went into the company account and her debt, calculated at the estimated cost of decades of soil rehabilitation, decreased by a fraction so small she would need 100 years to clear it. She had said as much to me during an inspection, with a faint smile that could have meant anything. I noted the output metrics and moved on. What I did not know, because the branch manager did not know, because the diagnostic instruments were not calibrated for it, was what happened after closing. Elena's production had fallen below her contracted minimum for 7 consecutive days. Not dramatically, just enough that the gap between what she owed and what she delivered widened each week. Her body had not fully recovered from the collapse. The ambient mana above depleted soil was thin. The atmospheric reserves that a healer normally drew from were barely present in Lumera now. Another cost of the miracle she had performed for a month straight. She could not allow the shortfall. She could not be the one who underperformed. The patients needed her. The contract needed her. She was the only healer within 300 miles whose capacity could resolve conditions surgery could not touch. She pressed her palms flat against the office floor. Below the dead topsoil, the powdered white layer that crumbled at a touch, lay bedrock, the ancient geological strata where the planet's oldest energy had accumulated over epochs. She had reached this once before, on the night everything began. That night, she had called it a miracle. She had not understood what she was taking. Now she understood. She reached anyway. The energy came up through her hands like water into a dry well, dense, immediate. Her depleted reserves filled in seconds. The fatigue behind her eyes cleared. Her hands steadied. She could feel the deep, ancient heat that the planet had spent millennia storing, and it moved through her blood as though it had been waiting for permission. The next morning, she healed her first patient in half the usual time. Her output metrics recovered. The branch manager noted the improvement without comment. She did not think about the cost. She did not allow herself to trace the line between the warmth in her hands and the cold that would eventually spread through the rock beneath the building. The first time, ignorance had been her defense. This time, there was no defense. She drew because the alternative was insufficiency, and Elena could not be insufficient. That was the architecture of the person, not a decision. Decisions can be reversed. Architecture cannot. The rock strata draw produced none of the surface indicators my monitoring was designed to detect. Sylvia's instruments read stable topsoil. The atmospheric mana showed normal background. The ancient reservoir drained silently from below in a direction nobody was watching. By the time anyone noticed, the damage would be the kind that does not have a repair timeline. It would simply be the new condition of the ground. Ethan came home on a weekday. Not to Limera, to the village south of it. The one his mother had lived in before Elena's distribution made addresses irrelevant. The company's expansion had reached it within the first 2 weeks of the reconstruction. A grain depot occupied the old market square, sorting stations, loading docks, a shift schedule posted by the entrance. His mother was at Station 4. She stood behind a waist-high counter, checking load weights against a printed manifest. Her hands moved with the careful rhythm of someone who had learned the job recently and intended to keep it. She was thinner than the last time he had seen her. She was at work. She had sent him a letter, 3 lines. Her address was on the envelope. She had not asked him to come. She had not told him to stay away. When she looked up and saw him standing in the depot doorway, she paused. Then she turned back to the manifest and finished the entry she was recording. He crossed the floor. He picked up a marking tool from the supply tray and stood beside her. The work was simple. Match the label to the list, mark the weight, slide the crate to staging. He had supervised road crews of 200. This was smaller. It required the same hands. They worked side by side through the morning. She did not ask where he had been. He did not explain. She did not say what she thought about the company that employed her or the man who owned it. He did not ask. The crates filled the silence the way crates do, heavy, specific, requiring attention. At the midday break, she brought him a cup of water and a piece of black wheat bread from the canteen. He ate it the way everyone in Limera ate it now, without expectation, without complaint, chewing through the grit because the grit was honest. She was tired. She was working. Those two things existed in the same woman at the same time, and neither one canceled the other. He stayed through the afternoon shift. When the depot closed, he walked her home. The village road had been repaved. The street lamps worked. The drainage ran clean. The houses needed paint, but the roofs were patched and the windows were sealed against the cold that still hung over the region months after Elena's ley line drain. She went inside without saying goodnight. He stood on the step for a moment. Then he followed. He was not ready to go back. The reasons he had left were still real, but they were becoming harder to hold in one hand, while the other hand filled with evidence that the system he had walked away from was the reason his mother had a job and a repaved road and bread that did not vanish when the magic ran out. Garrett opened the route book and uncapped his pen. Corridor entry, temperature at descent, fuel consumption through the first kilometer. The numbers were better across every line. The vehicles had been refitted since the first run, upgraded cooling systems, wider tires rated for sustained heat, improved air filtration that did not fail at the midpoint. The crew knew the route the way a driver knows a commute. The sulfur smell was occupational background. At the midpoint, the fire dragon surfaced from the magma flow. Same scale, same ancient presence, same wreath of flame that turned the corridor air into something closer to a furnace than a road. But Garrett's lead truck carried the standing order, 4 tons of aged beef, vacuum sealed, loaded in the rearmost cargo bay specifically for this. The Dragon recognized the vehicles. 30 days since the last delivery. The arrangement was reliable. Garrett pulled to the corridor wall, popped the rear seal, and waited. The Dragon took the beef. Passage opened. The convoy rolled through without stopping. He noted the clearance time, 14 minutes faster than the first run. No confrontation. No test bursts against the hull. A commercial relationship between a fleet of armored trucks and a mythological creature, settled in beef and punctuality. The convoy surfaced in Limera through the same crater. A maintenance crew had reinforced the lip with poured concrete since the last emergence, one of the branch manager's early improvements. The trucks rolled up the ramp and onto level ground. No detonation of stone, no sulfur eruption, just vehicles arriving on schedule. Garrett filed the report. Cargo delivered. No casualties, no vehicle losses. Transit time reduced by 22%. Next run in 30 days. He closed the route book and set it on the dash. The most dangerous passage in the world was a scheduled service now. The extraordinary made ordinary through repetition. That was logistics. That was the job doing what the job was supposed to do. The branch manager came to me first. 1 month earlier, when Elena's popularity peaked and the boycott crushed our public standing, Gnome Bank had frozen our accounts and pulled every line of credit. The branch manager had stamped the cutoff notice himself. I kept the copy. Sylvia filed it under a category she labeled future leverage. He arrived at our headquarters carrying a box of expensive pastries and a proposal to reinstate our credit at a reduced interest rate. Sylvia made him wait 1 hour. No tea. No eye contact from the staff who passed him in the corridor. When I finally let him in, he crossed the room with a grin stretched so tight it looked surgical and called the whole affair a system error. I let him finish. Then I placed his own cutoff notice on the desk between us and asked whether the system had also dictated the line he had written in the margin, the one about companies without social credibility. He stuttered through 3 versions of an excuse. I stopped him before the 4th. "I do not need your credit line," I said. "I do not need your interest rate. I do not need your pastries." Sylvia set the stack of documents in front of him. Share transfer agreements, 53 of them. Gnome Bank's stock had collapsed after the boycott reversed. Depositors fled. Shareholders panic sold. The shares had been widely distributed with no single entity holding more than 4%. I had purchased 51% through subsidiary accounts over 3 trading days. Nobody noticed because nobody watches a stock that has lost 2/3 of its value in a month. He read the top page and his knees quit. He sank to the floor of my office and looked up at me the way a man looks at a locked door when the key is on the other side. I told him he was being transferred to the Lumera branch, the farthest, hardest assignment in the network. Rubble and mud and manual ledgers. He would learn what banking looked like when the clients had dirt under their fingernails. He left the room smaller than he had entered it. Sylvia collected the pastry box and dropped it in the waste bin unopened. "The settlement network and underground vaults," I said. "I need both for what comes next." She nodded. She had stopped asking what comes next somewhere around the 3rd expansion. Watching was faster. The red arrived overnight. Every wall on the main commercial boulevard was plastered with posters. Red ink on white paper, the color of something that wants to be noticed before it wants to be understood. The slogans were simple. Revolution pricing. The future belongs to everyone. 70% below standard retail. Goliath Corporation opened its first store in the capital on a Tuesday. The building was painted red from awning to foundation. The product line was comprehensive. Stoves, heating units, lighting fixtures, refrigeration boxes, cleaning machines. Every category we sold, every form factor we had designed. The prices were so far below ours that comparison was not competition. It was humiliation. A stove that cost 10 gold in our stores sold for 3 across the street. The crowds came like water through a cracked dam. By noon, the line wrapped the block. Our flagship store on the opposite side of the road was silent. The staff stood at the windows and watched their customers walk away. The same thing happened simultaneously in the port cities, the mining towns, the agricultural villages. Not a slow erosion, a coordinated flood. Red banners unfurling across every market I had spent years building. I sent the quality team to purchase samples. They brought a stove, a refrigeration unit, and a cleaning machine to the development lab. Henry and I stood at the bench while the team cracked the casings open. The exterior was our design copied to the millimeter. Button placement, ventilation grill pattern, housing curvature. Inside, every cost center that made the product safe had been removed. The high-purity wiring was replaced with raw copper that would overheat within weeks. The insulation was packed loose with gaps you could fit a finger through. The core power stone was scrap-grade material we rejected at the intake dock before it reached the testing line. The safety limiter had been bypassed with a copper bridge soldered directly across the regulation circuit. Crude, effective for a demonstration. The stove would ignite, boil water, impress a customer. It would also, within 6 months of daily use, overheat past its housing tolerance and melt from the inside. At worst, the power stone would destabilize. The engineering word for that is not malfunction, it is detonation. Henry ran his thumb along the copper bridge and said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. They had our circuit layout. They understood the topology well enough to copy it. They did not understand, or did not care, why every component they removed existed. Sales collapsed, 40% across all divisions in the first week, 65% in small appliances. Warehouses filled with inventory that had no destination. Factory lines ran product into storage bays that were already full. Staff who had built those products with their hands watched the red store across the street sell disposable imitations of their work at a pace our quality standards could never match. I filed the patent and consumer safety lawsuit the same week. The courtroom smelled like floor wax and precedent. Victor sat at the defense table in a tailored suit with a gold tooth visible when he smiled, which was constantly. His legal team had not prepared to defend the products. They had prepared to reframe the argument. His lead attorney held both stoves side by side. Blue logo, red logo. He pointed out that the button placement differed by 3 centimeters. The corner radius was different. The color was different. He called it independent design convergence. He called the stripped safety architecture a cost reduction innovation that served working families. Our attorney argued the isolation layer, the scrap grade core, the bypass bridge, the projected failure rate within 6 months of regular use. The jury was drawn from the general population. They nodded when Victor's attorney said affordable. They shifted in their seats when ours said isolation circuit. Victor's attorney turned to face the gallery. He called us a monopoly, attempting to crush a competitor that dared to offer the same product at a fair price. He called our safety standards a luxury tax on the poor. The gallery murmured. The jurors murmured with them. I took the stand. I asked the judge whether he would ride a carriage whose wheel pins had been replaced with soft wood to cut cost. The courtroom went quiet for 3 seconds. Then Victor stood and said Goliath had sold 100,000 units without a single major incident. He said the minor flare-ups were user error. He said the instruction manual specified a usage limit in small print on the final page, but specified. The gallery applauded him. The judge ruled against us on both counts. The visual similarity was insufficient for infringement under current commercial law. The safety claim was dismissed on procedural standing. Our legal team had prepared for the infringement argument and had not adequately prepared for the procedural challenge. Victor had hired specifically for this case. He knew our methods. He prepared accordingly. I read the judgment twice. The reasoning was technically correct. The law was built for a world that moved slower than this one. I instructed Sylvia to pay the court costs and close the file. She asked about an appeal. I said no. 18 months for an appeal. In 18 months, every kitchen in the empire would contain a red stove with a bypass limiter. The law was not going to save us. I needed something the law could not touch. That night, I suspended all new appliance manufacturing. Every remaining unit of capital, including the full credit line from Gnome Bank, the bank I now owned specifically for this purpose, was redirected into a single project. I stood in front of the continental route map and traced the line with my finger. From the capital, through every major city within 2,000 kilometers, across the continental divide to the western trade ports. 10,000 kilometers of high-specification rail, proprietary gauge, proprietary scheduling algorithm, integration with the Divine Realm logistics network through access agreements bound to me personally, which meant no competitor could replicate the network even if they replicated the track. The Obsidian Transcontinental Railway. Goliath could copy a stove. He could copy a refrigerator. He could not copy a transport infrastructure network that required years of land acquisition, engineering tolerances his scrap-grade supply chain could not meet, and Divine Realm access that was not for sale. The railway was a moat. If it launched, the company was untouchable for a generation. If it failed, the company was finished. I called Henry in at 11 that night. He arrived with graphite on his fingers and a rolled blueprint under his arm. He had been working on the locomotive frame modifications since the court ruling, before I announced anything. He had arrived at the same conclusion by a different route. Small appliances were a lost front. Infrastructure was the only defensible ground. He unrolled the design on my desk. Multi-layered engine housing, redundant cooling systems, a frame rated for continuous high-output operation across temperature extremes. Months of parallel refinement done on his own time. There is a thermal exhaust problem in the third cooling loop, he said. Output destabilizes above 70% sustained load. I have not solved it. How long? 2 months, maybe 3. You have until opening day. He rolled the blueprint, tucked it under his arm, and walked out. No negotiation. The job was the job. I trusted Henry the way I trusted a column in a ledger, not because he was sentimental about the company, but because he was precise. Every joint he welded held. Every circuit he designed performed to specification. His craftsmanship was not something he did. It was something he was. That was why I gave him the most important engineering project in the company's history. And that was why the break, when it came, cut deeper than any court ruling or price war. Opening day was supposed to be the answer. The Obsidian sat on platform 1 like a blade that had never been drawn. 100 meters of black iron polished until the morning fog beaded on its surface. Henry's design. Every rivet, every seal, every thermal pathway. The station was full. Dignitaries, diplomats, journalists, investors. A brass band played near the platform edge. The invitation list was built to maximize coverage. This was not a ceremony. This was the company's last public argument for its own survival. I stepped to the podium. The microphone was live. "Hold on!" The voice came from the station entrance. Loud, theatrical, timed to the second. Victor walked down the center aisle in a checkered suit with a gold lapel pin, flanked by assistants and the Minister of Construction. The minister was sweating. He unrolled an official parchment with trembling hands and read aloud. The Imperial Parliament had passed the Railway Nationalization Act. All transcontinental rail infrastructure was reclassified as public property under eminent domain, effective immediately. Compensation at assessed value, a fraction of construction cost. 10,000 kilometers of track, purchased, surveyed, graded, and laid with company funds, seized. Sylvia started to protest. I stopped her. The law was valid. I did not hold legislative authority. Victor had spent 6 months feeding that legislation to sympathetic lawmakers. He had offered Goliath Express revenue shares to the government in exchange for the seizure order. The timing was not coincidence. It was planned the way Henry planned a cooling system. Every component placed months before the moment it was needed. Then the whistle from platform 2. A locomotive pulled in, gold-painted, gaudy, steam belching from exhaust ports that were calibrated wrong. The Goliath Express. Its profile matched the Obsidian's exactly. Wheel spacing, coupler geometry, engine vent placement. Not approximately, precisely. Henry was standing near the Goliath podium. No company badge, no eye contact. Shoulders drawn in, hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground. He had stolen the blueprints. He had defected weeks ago. The sick days, the unanswered messages, the thermal exhaust problem he said he was still solving. He had taken the design before the fix was complete. The Goliath locomotive had his original layout without his safety margins. The third cooling loop was still broken. He knew it. He had built the engine, and he knew what would happen when someone pushed it past 70% sustained output. His daughter's treatment costs had exceeded his salary by a margin no raise could close. Victor offered 3 times his pay, plus a signing payment that covered the treatment in full. Henry did the math the way he did everything, precisely, without sentiment. He arrived at the answer he did not want and could not argue with. I did not know the details yet. I learned them later. In the moment, standing on platform 1, what I registered was simpler. The space beside me, where he had stood every day for the past year, was empty. The man who had built the engine I was supposed to unveil was standing near a podium that was not ours, and he would not look up. The rain started. The crowds shifted toward platform 2. Gold was brighter than black. Cheap was louder than good. The dignitaries migrated with the polite speed of people who had already decided where the future was. Victor said something to the crowd. I did not listen. The Goliath Express pulled out of the station on my rails, carrying my design, built by my engineer. The crowd cheered. The Obsidian did not move. Its engine was cold. The bunting sagged under the rain. Sylvia held out an umbrella. I waved it away. Back to headquarters, development lab, everyone. A junior employee asked if we were done. I told him it was not a dismissal, it was a redirect. I walked to the car in the rain. It ran down my collar and filled my shoes, and I did not adjust my pace. The Obsidian sat alone on the track behind me, 100 meters of black iron that nobody had ridden, on rails that no longer belonged to me, in a station that was emptying. Victor had the track. Victor had the court. Victor had Henry. Victor had the crowd. I had the thermal exhaust data that Henry took before the fix was finished, which meant Goliath's locomotive carried a flaw its new owner understood but could not repair without the man he had purchased. And the man he had purchased could not fix it without admitting what he had left behind. That was not a plan yet. plans would come in the dry room under the lab lights with the people who had not crossed the platform. What I had was a fact, and facts are patient. The newspaper the next morning ran the Goliath Express debut above the fold. In small print at the bottom, our company had placed a 3-word advertisement, announcement forthcoming. Seek us out. It was not confidence. It was the refusal to stay down where the audience could see. The bruise was internal. The posture was vertical. That was the job. The celebration across the Capitol was still going when I climbed into the waste yard. Goliath's construction site dumped its industrial refuse through our waste processing subsidiary. Standard contract. Their logistics people never thought twice about it because nobody ever thinks twice about garbage. That was the kind of oversight that kept me employed. Ethan was already there. No announcement, no explanation for the months he had been gone. He was knee-deep in runoff, pulling scrap from the disposal trench with his bare hands, the way a man pulls weeds from a garden he never stopped owning. He glanced up when I arrived, nodded once, and went back to digging. I did not ask where he had been. He did not offer. The work was the conversation. We hauled 3 sacks of discarded components back to the underground lab. Burst pipe joints corroded red inside, a control valve that should have contained a flow regulation plate, but held nothing except degraded coolant. Heat exchanger fragments, where the mithril cooling fins from Henry's original design had been replaced with welded iron sheeting, and a tin water tank. I laid them on the examination table, the way a coroner lays out evidence. The control valve was first. I opened it with a pry tool, and the degraded oil inside ran black across the steel surface. No flow regulation plate. Without it, every unit of energy fed into the engine flowed unrestricted, full throttle with no modulation. The only way to reduce power was to cut the fuel line entirely. Primitive, Ethan said. He was holding the heat exchanger fragment up to the light. They replaced the mithril air cooling system with a water tank. A magic engine runs past 2,000 degrees. Water boils in seconds. So they designed it to need constant resupply, I said. Across a cross-continental railway, through stretches of open wilderness, where there is no water for 200 miles. He set the fragment down. His jaw was tight. The reactor shielding was last. I placed a charred metal shard under the magic energy microscope, and the monitor showed its crystal structure, shattered. Microfractures running through it like cracks in dry riverbed clay. The material was lead. Lead blocks radiation well enough, but under concentrated magic energy, it has no resistance. Sustained operation would erode the shielding from the inside out. I pulled Henry's original prototype specifications from the engineering archive. The comparison was exact. 3 safety systems had been in the design: the flow regulation valve, the mithril air cooling array, and the magic-resistant reactor shielding. All 3 had been removed or replaced with cheaper alternatives. How long? Ethan asked. At full sustained output, approximately 50 hours, 2 days. After that, the shielding collapses. The reactor goes uncontained, and the magic energy expands without limit. He understood what that meant without needing the rest. 500 passengers inside a machine that would accelerate until its own containment failed. And when containment failed at speed, the result would not be a breakdown. We stop it, he said. His voice was flat, the way it gets when the thing he is saying is not a suggestion. With what evidence? Scrap pulled from a waste yard. Any court would call it fabricated. Any newspaper would print Victor's denial above our accusation. The government approved the route. The public is still celebrating. He hit the examination table. The steel rang and the scrap pieces shifted. I let the sound die before I spoke again. We cannot stop it, but we can be there when it happens. The Obsidian locomotive had survived the nationalization because the law seized the track infrastructure, not the rolling stock. The train itself was still mine. I stripped the passenger configuration that night. Luxury seating, dining car fittings, decorative paneling, all of it came out. In its place, I designed a rescue and recovery loadout, reinforced coupling mechanisms, rated to match speed with a runaway train and hold station while linking, a pressurized water cannon system for fire suppression, emergency medical bays with trauma stabilization equipment, a modified power system retuned from speed to torque, the kind of output profile that could chase down a disaster and hold position alongside it long enough to pull people across. Ethan did not question the design. He read the specifications, picked up a wrench, and started on the coupling assembly. I filed the modification paperwork with the Railway Authority the following morning. Certified rescue vehicle. The race rules required a safety observer to be present on the course. Our certification fulfilled that requirement exactly. Victor could not block us from the starting line without admitting the race needed no safety measures and admitting that would raise every question he could not afford. He found out within the day. His response traveled through the press the way his responses always did. He called it a publicity stunt. He asked what kind of competitor entered a race with an ambulance. He laughed on the front page and his supporters laughed with him. I did not answer. The filing was the answer. The Obsidian was not entering the race to win it. The Obsidian was entering the race because someone had to be close enough to save the people on the train that would not finish. I called every factory manager and division head into one conference. Monitors filled the wall, tired faces from every corner of the operation, people who had been losing market share for weeks and wearing the loss in their posture. Effective immediately, I said. All manufacturing lines halt. All service centers close. All retail locations lock their doors. No product leaves any warehouse. No shipment moves. The silence lasted 2 seconds before it broke into noise. I let them finish. The market chose Goliath's products because they were cheaper. If those products are equivalent to ours, this shutdown will be irrelevant. The market will function without us. I paused long enough for the implication to land. If they are not equivalent, the market will demonstrate the difference on its own. No advertisement, no press conference, no argument from us. Silence is the message. I pledged my personal assets and the headquarters building as collateral for 6 months of employee payroll. The factories could afford 3 dark days. 3 days was enough. The first day was confusion. People arrived at our storefronts, read the closed signs, shrugged, and walked to the nearest Goliath outlet. By the second day, the shrugging stopped. Goliath heating units overheated in normal use. Lighting fixtures flickered and died within hours. A Goliath stove detonated in the textile district during a product demonstration. The fire gutted a wooden apartment, and the newspaper ran it below the fold as user error. Victor's people had reached the police chief's office before the ashes cooled. Sylvia tracked the bribe through our banking network and filed it without comment. By the third day, tens of thousands of requests for our factories to reopen had flooded every channel we owned. People who had thrown our products away during the price war were offering double the retail price for secondhand units. Used Leonardo appliances traded above new Goliath ones. Broken Goliath products piled in repair shops that had no parts, no manuals, and no training. The market had delivered its verdict, not through loyalty, not through argument, through 3 days of living with the alternative. Sylvia brought me the consolidated request count on the third evening. She set the document on my desk and said nothing. The number spoke for itself. I initialed the page and turned back to the factory floor. The factories would reopen, but not yet. First, there was an engine to build. The factory doors sealed on the first night and did not open until the third morning. Every resource freed by the production shutdown funneled into one build, the highest grade mithril alloy on the market, heat-resistant ceramic from the dwarf foundries, and every engineer who had stayed, working around the clock in rotating shifts on a single engine, the Prometheus. I did not delegate the core work. There is a margin between safe and not safe, and I had spent too many years watching other people ignore that margin to hand it to anyone now. Not when this engine would carry people. The mithril pistons were first, 12 of them. Each one had to be machined to a tolerance of 1/1000th of a millimeter, and the alloy was harder than anything our cutting tools could handle without introducing vibration at the microscopic level. The head machinist said the equipment could not reach the precision. I told him we would finish by hand. I took a diamond file from the tool chest and sat down at the bench. The rhythm came back the way old rhythms do. It was not different from the dungeon nights when I sat on cold stone and worked a whetstone across blade edges until the metal gave me what I needed. The material was finer, the stakes were higher. The motion was the same. One stroke. Check the surface, another stroke. Check. The sweat hit the workbench and I did not wipe it. 2 hours per piston, the filing sound filling the factory like a heartbeat, and nobody interrupted it. Ethan measured the first finished piston. His gauge could not find the error. He looked at me the way he had not looked at me since the dungeon, with something between respect and the quiet understanding that what he had just watched was not teachable. 11 more, I said. The The blood came through my fingertips around the fifth one. I wrapped them and kept filing. Every safety system went in. The flow regulation valves Henry had originally specified. The mithril air cooling array with its 10,000 hand-soldered cooling fins. The magic-resistant reactor shielding rated for sustained high-output operation. And past Henry's design, I added what the scrap analysis taught me. Redundant thermal cutoffs. A secondary containment shell. Everything Victor had stripped for cost, rebuilt from zero. Everything Victor had never imagined, added on top. Assembly was a single unbroken sequence, pistons into cylinders. The fit so precise that each one compressed the trapped air with a clean mechanical whisper, the sound of surfaces meeting with nothing between them. Crankshaft, connecting rods, camshaft, every component hand-polished, not for appearance, but because at these tolerances, surface imperfection meant friction, and friction meant energy wasted as heat and noise instead of motion. On the third morning, I stood at the control panel and pressed ignition. The factory lights dimmed for 1 second as the engine drew power. Then quiet. Not the quiet of failure, the quiet of nothing wasted. 12 pistons firing in perfect counterbalance, their forces canceling so completely that a glass of water on the workbench did not ripple. I opened the throttle. 1,000 revolutions, 2,000, 5,000. The sound did not grow louder. It refined itself, narrowing into a single clean tone like wind through a mountain pass. No thermal variance, no vibration. Stable output across the full range. Ethan stood at the readout console for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "I have never heard an engine do that. Neither had I." I wrote the results in the ledger and signed the verification line. The same ledger I had kept since the dungeon, when nobody asked me to keep one. I kept it anyway. That was the job. Dawn at the central station. Flat white light across both platforms. Victor's Goliath Express sat on platform 1. Gold paint chipping at the joints. Black soot along the undercarriage. Sulfur haze drifting from the incomplete combustion in its stack. The crowd was enormous, but the tone had shifted. 3 days without reliable appliances had rewritten the mood. The cheering was thinner. Doubt filled the spaces where certainty used to be. Victor stood on the observation deck, waving, grinning, sweating through his collar. He had sold every seat. Investors, journalists, families who believed the race would prove Goliath's dominance once and for all. 500 passengers who did not know about the lead shielding, the missing safety systems, or the vial of nitro his crew was feeding into the fuel line behind a closed door. Nitro, a concentrated magic energy accelerant designed for mining detonation work. Mixed into engine fuel, it would triple output for a short burst and drive the reactor temperature past every material limit in the locomotive. Victor's plan was to win the visual race in the first 10 kilometers, before Prometheus could demonstrate anything that mattered. He did not understand that speed purchased on borrowed time is still a debt, and debts come due. Platform 2 went quiet. Not empty quiet, pressure quiet. Prometheus entered the station without sound. 150 meters of matte black. No banners, no gold, no decoration. The wheels made no audible contact with the rail. The magnetic suspension and the hand-polished bearings carried the mass the way deep water carries weight, silently and completely. I stepped onto the platform in my work clothes. 3 days of oil and factory soot still on the coveralls. Victor's voice carried across the gap. Something about my appearance, something about poverty. I did not look at him. I could smell the nitro from where I stood. Acidic, faintly sweet, unmistakable to anyone who had worked with volatile compounds. "All stations," I said into the line. Ethan confirmed engine room ready. Rescue systems armed. Coupling mechanisms in standby. The signal dropped. The Goliath Express detonated off the line. Wheels spinning against the rail. Sparks sheeting across the platform. A wall of smoke and noise as the nitro ignition slammed through the fuel system. The locomotive launched like a shell from a cannon. Fast, genuinely fast. The crowd gasped. Within seconds, the golden train had cleared the station and was shrinking toward the horizon, trailing fire and black exhaust. Prometheus did not appear to move. The acceleration was so smooth that the transition from stillness to motion was invisible. I fed the throttle in millimeter increments, letting the wheels grip without a single rotation of slip. No wasted energy, no spectacle. The speed built the way pressure builds behind a sealed valve, quietly, and then all at once. The capital fell away, open plains ahead. I could see the Goliath Express a kilometer forward, shaking and smoking and screaming through the landscape like something running from what it could not name. I engaged the second stage. The turbocharger cycled. Compressed energy flooded the combustion chamber. 80 per hour, 90, 100. The needles climbed and the engine tone did not waver. It clarified. The gap closed. 500 meters, 300. I could see Victor on the observation car, turned backward, staring. His face passed through surprise and arrived at something worse. The understanding that speed bought with nitro is rented, and the thing gaining on him owned every kilometer it covered. At the 12-kilometer mark, Prometheus overtook. No turbulence, no roar. A black shape that was behind, then beside, then ahead, pulling away with the quiet certainty of something that was always going to be faster. In the rearview mirror, Victor ordered the second nitro injection. I saw the fresh eruption of smoke from the Goliath stack, darker and more violent than before. The locomotive surged, then shuddered. The reactor temperature was climbing past the lead shielding's threshold now. The erosion was self-accelerating. At speed, uncontained, the mathematics were simple and the mathematics were final. "Ethan," I said, "rescue systems to active." His voice came back steady. "Already done." I kept the throttle open. The race was over. What came next was the reason I had stripped the obsidian down to its bones and rebuilt it as something that could save the people Victor had put aboard a machine he never understood. The plains stretched ahead, flat and clean. Behind me, the golden train burned. 40 kilometers in, the Goliath Express stopped being a locomotive and became a projectile. The second nitro injection pushed the reactor past its thermal ceiling. The shielding, Henry's original design had specified triple-layered magic-resistant composite, was a single layer of commercial-grade lead alloy. At operating temperature, the lead could not resist the concentrated magic energy. It began to erode. The erosion created a feedback loop. Less shielding meant more heat radiation into the fuel chamber, which meant faster erosion, which meant more heat. The reactor output was self-amplifying. The locomotive was accelerating on its own physics, and nobody at the controls could change that. The Goliath engineer reached for the emergency brake. The emergency braking system depended on the flow control valve, the master failsafe that regulated energy flow through the engine. Without it, there was no mechanical override for the reactor feedback loop. There was no flow control valve. The brake handle moved through its full range of motion. Nothing happened. Heat from the magic reactor was already traveling backward through the cooling pipes into the passenger cars. The cheap insulation in the walls had started to char. Smoke seeped through floor seams. The temperature inside the cars climbed past what the air conditioning could manage, then past what the air conditioning could survive. The units failed. The windows would not open, sealed shut by the thermal expansion of their frames. A chandelier fell in the third car. Someone screamed. In the fourth passenger car, Henry sat watching the instrument panel mounted on the wall. The display showed speed and power output in simplified form for passengers. The readings were wrong, not incorrect in the way a gauge sometimes drifts. Wrong in the specific way that told him the reactor had entered uncontrolled escalation. He had designed the original system. He knew what each number meant before the onboard diagnostics could register the condition, because the diagnostics had been built to his specifications, and the specifications had been built to catch exactly this failure mode. He stood up. He told the passengers around him to move to the rear cars. His voice was quiet and certain. A few passengers looked at him with confusion. Most of them moved. His calm was the only evidence they needed that someone in this car understood what was happening, and they did not. In the Prometheus cab, the monitoring system registered the Goliath Express's acceleration anomaly. I saw the thermal signature spike on the instrument panel, a climbing red line that matched the scrap analysis projection from the waste yard, beat for beat. 3 hours was the predicted failure window under normal operation. The nitro had compressed it to 90 minutes. "Rescue protocol," I said. "Match speed. Hold station." Ethan's voice came back from the engine room. He was already on it. Prometheus matched the Goliath Express's speed and held position 6 meters to the right on the parallel track. I was driving. The Goliath was shaking and swerving with every surge of its uncontrolled reactor, and I read its movement pattern the way you read a drunk stagger. There was a rhythm in the chaos, and I matched it, adjusting Prometheus's position in millimeter corrections to keep the gap stable. 6 meters. At this speed, 6 meters was the width of a coffin turned sideways. Garrett opened the side access panel and stepped onto the running board. Wind hit him like a wall of solid pressure. His coveralls whipped against his body. The ground was a blur 40 meters down, ties and gravel moving so fast they became a single gray smear. The Goliath Express's hull was a wall of gold-painted metal 6 meters away, the paint blistering and peeling from the heat, vibrating with the reactor's uncontrolled output. He walked to the end of the running board. He measured the gap with his eyes the same way he measured foundation tolerances on road construction, the same way he calculated clearances in the magma corridor runs. Every job he had done for 3 years, the convoys, the Dragon, the second run through the tunnels, had been training for a moment exactly like this one. Precision under conditions that would kill anyone who flinched. He jumped 6 meters of open air between 2 moving trains. He crossed it in less than a second. Both hands caught the Goliath Express's side rail. The impact tore a gash across his right palm, but his grip held. His body slammed against the hull. The metal was hot enough to burn through his coveralls at the shoulder. He pulled himself across, got his feet on the external maintenance ledge, and forced the emergency access door open with one kick. He propped the door and went back across. The return jump was worse. He was jumping against the wind now, and the gap had widened by half a meter as the Goliath swerved. He caught the Prometheus running board with one hand and hauled himself in. He picked up the portable coupling mechanism and carried it back across a third time. He attached it between the 2 trains, locking brackets onto both sets of running boards, creating a mechanical bridge that stabilized the lateral relationship between the locomotives and gave them a transfer path wide enough for a person to cross. He signaled Ethan, ready. 3 crossings, 6 meters each, at speed. The orc who had found dignity in precise, physically demanding work that others would not do had just done the thing none of them could. Ethan moved through the passenger cars the way he moved through construction sites, methodical, steady, section by section. He had done emergency clearance protocols 1,000 times on his work crews. The passengers were not construction workers, but the principle was the same. Clear the area, check every corner, move everyone in one direction. Do not stop until the count is right. He kicked the first car's connecting door open and shouted over the noise. His voice was the command voice, not performing authority, just using it. The passengers near the door moved. The ones farther back needed more. Garrett was at the bridge, catching people as they crossed. His massive frame filled the coupling platform. Passengers who froze at the sight of the gap between the trains found themselves lifted and set down on the Prometheus side before they could finish deciding whether to scream. He was not gentle about it. He did not need to be. Car 1, clear. Car 2, clear. Car 3, a mother and a small girl, wedged into a window seat. The mother was gripping her daughter with both arms, locked rigid. The girl's face was buried in her mother's coat. Neither of them was moving. The floor around them was hot enough to feel through shoe soles, and the smoke had dropped to shoulder height. Ethan knelt beside them. He did not shout. He spoke clearly and directly, the way a site supervisor speaks to a worker trapped under debris. Not with sympathy, not with urgency, but with the absolute certainty that what he is about to do will work. He told the girl he was going to carry her. He told the mother to hold his hand and not let go. The girl looked up at him. She was maybe 4 years old. Her eyes were red from the smoke. He picked her up. She weighed nothing. He carried her across the coupling bridge to Prometheus with one arm, while his other hand held the mother's wrist. Garrett steadied them from the Prometheus side. The mother's knees buckled when she stepped off the bridge, and Garrett caught her elbow without a word. Car 4, Car 5, clear. The seats in Car 5 were already starting to smolder. He swept the train twice. On the second pass, in the last car, he found Henry. Henry was sitting by the rear instrument panel. He was not panicking. He was watching the readings with the focused attention of a man who had designed the system and knew exactly how long they had. The numbers on the display were climbing in the pattern he had specified as the catastrophic failure curve years ago, in a design document nobody at Goliath had read. "Time to go," Ethan said. Henry looked at him. There was something in his eyes that was not fear and not guilt and not relief. It was the weight of knowing that the machine about to kill everyone had been his design, stripped of everything that would have prevented this. He was the last person who deserved to be rescued. He knew that. He also knew he could not fix any of it by staying. "I know," Henry said. He stood. He went. Ethan's signal came through. All passengers cleared. I confirmed the count. Every person who had boarded the Goliath Express that morning was on Prometheus. Every person except one. Victor was in the observation car. He had spent the entire evacuation making calls to his legal team and his investors, trying to manage the public relations disaster from a leather chair while the train disintegrated around him. He was not a passenger in any sense that mattered. He was the man who had built the machine, stripped it, filled it with people, and poured nitro into the reactor because losing the race was worse than losing the passengers. He did not believe the locomotive was going to crash until every other person was already off. I gave the order to decouple. The coupling mechanism released and Prometheus pulled ahead. Behind us, the Goliath Express continued accelerating, unmanned now, a runaway machine burning from the inside, heading for the end of the track. The track ended at the Eastern Canyon. The bridge over the canyon was unfinished. My company had been building it before the nationalization halted construction. The rails were not laid. If the Goliath Express reached that gap at speed, it would go over the edge, but the bridge infrastructure would go with it. Years of work. The only crossing point for the Continental Rail Line, the Eastern Switch Junction, was 3 kilometers ahead of the canyon. A siding track branched off the main line there and ran 100 meters to a concrete construction barrier at the canyon's rim. The siding had been built for work vehicles during the bridge construction. It ended in open air. If I could reach the junction first and set the switch, the Goliath Express would be diverted onto the siding instead of continuing toward the bridge, the siding track, the barrier, the canyon wall. It would be over. I opened the throttle. Prometheus had no passengers to protect now. The acceleration was immediate. We reached the junction with 40 seconds to spare. The switch mechanism was part of the nationalized infrastructure control system, automated, remotely operated, and locked behind access codes I no longer had. I set it manually. The lever in the junction box was stiff from disuse. I pulled it. It moved. The track realigned. Prometheus cleared the junction on the main line. I counted the seconds. The Goliath Express hit the switch at full uncontrolled acceleration and took the siding. The wheels screamed against the curve. The siding was designed for work vehicles moving at crawl speed, not a runaway locomotive at 120. The cheap axles could not handle the lateral force. They snapped. 100 meters of track, then the barrier, then the canyon. The gold-painted locomotive left the rails, struck the barrier, and went over the edge. The explosion in the canyon threw a column of fire and black smoke high enough to be visible from the Capitol. The Goliath Express, Victor's name, and every shortcut he had ever approved became wreckage at the bottom of a gorge that would take years to clear. I did not watch. I was already decelerating Prometheus and opening the passenger compartment doors. Behind me, the smoke rose in a black column against the afternoon sky. That was Victor's monument. He built it himself. Ethan found Henry at a workers' hostel 3 days after the crash. He was not hiding. He was sitting on a cot in a shared room, staring at his hands. The same hands that had drawn the original designs. The hands that had modified those designs on Victor's orders until every safety system was gone. He had not left the hostel since walking off the rescue train. Ethan sat down on the cot opposite him. He did not open with a speech. "Leo has a position open on the engineering team," he said. Henry did not look up. "Why would he offer that?" "I do not know. The offer is real." Henry was quiet for a long time. The hostel was thin-walled, and they could hear the wind moving across the canyon outside, the canyon where the wreckage of his stolen design was still burning. His daughter was stable. The hospital had not revoked her treatment after Goliath's collapse. That debt was his to carry regardless. "I stole his work," Henry said. "I gave it to a man who stripped it down and put passengers on it." "Yeah," Ethan said. "You did." Neither of them pretended it was more complicated than that. They sat with it. Henry reported to the factory the next morning. He did not speak to me directly until our second meeting, when I asked him to review the Prometheus secondary cooling specifications for improvement opportunities. He opened the drawings. He started working. His hands were steady. I did not ask for an explanation. I did not ask for an apology. The early warning he had given from the instrument panel, telling passengers to move to the rear cars, signaling through the readings that the failure was imminent, had given me the data I needed to time the rescue protocol. That was Henry's value. He saw what mattered before anyone else did, and he acted on it even when acting cost him everything. The apology was less important than the work. It always had been. Sylvia received the acquisition notice on her terminal at 2 p.m. Goliath Corporation's board had voted to accept an emergency buyout offer. The company's liabilities, crash damages, public safety investigation fines, insurance claims from 500 passengers, wrongful death inquiries, customer lawsuits, exceeded its total assets by a factor that made insolvency the polite description. The alternative to accepting the offer was criminal prosecution of the entire board for the safety failures that caused the crash. The acquiring entity was a holding company registered under a neutral name. That company was owned by a subsidiary. That subsidiary was owned by another subsidiary. That subsidiary was owned by the Leonardo Trading Company. Sylvia had built the structure herself. She countersigned the relevant documents, filed the acquisition notification with the Merchant Guild, added Goliath's asset portfolio, its factories, its rail contracts, its equipment, its debt, to the company's quarterly report as a line item. She prepared Leo's coffee, deep roast, hot. She set it on his desk for when he arrived. She did not celebrate. She had prepared the acquisition structure before the race, built the legal framework for multiple outcomes, ready to execute whichever scenario the result required. Leo had called it a contingency. She had built it as a certainty. The woman who had managed every crisis in the company's history, from the dungeon departure to the Divine Realm siege, to the St. Arc boycott to the factory shutdown, closed the final corporate war from her desk without standing up. 3 days after the crash, I found Garrett at the staging area. He was repairing a coupling mechanism, the one he had carried across the gap between two moving trains. It had bent during the bridge maneuver. The metal had warped under the stress of holding two locomotives together while hundreds of passengers crossed. He was straightening it by hand, working a heavy wrench against the bent bracket with the same patient precision he brought to every piece of equipment that passed through his hands. A small boy came around the corner of the platform, 5 or 6 years old. His mother was behind him. One of the passengers Garrett had carried across during the evacuation, the woman with the small daughter. The boy was holding a handkerchief, his own, small, white, slightly frayed at the edges from use. He walked up to Garrett and pointed at the cut on his hand, a gash across the right palm from grabbing the Goliath Express's side rail at full speed. The wound had closed, but it was still raw. Green blood had dried along the edges. Garrett held out his hand. The boy tied the handkerchief around it carefully, the way a child ties a bandage. More knot than wrap, the loops uneven, earnest enough to make up for the technique. He patted it twice when he was done, the way he had probably seen someone do in a picture book. The mother thanked Garrett. Her voice caught. She did not say what she was thanking him for because the list was too long and the words were too small. He told her it was the job. That evening, Garrett and I shared a drink at the depot. He sat on a supply crate. I sat on the one next to it. The bottle was cheap. The cups were tin. The staging area was quiet except for the cooling ticks of Prometheus's engine behind us, the locomotive resting on the track the way a horse rests after a long run. He had not taken the bandage off. The child's handkerchief was still wrapped around his hand, slightly bloodstained, perfectly knotted, the most important thing he owned. Not a medal, not a ceremony, a piece of cloth from a boy who was not afraid of him. I noticed. I did not say anything about it. There are things you do not reduce to a ledger entry, and this was one of them. I opened my ledger. The last entry was from the first night, the dungeon, 4 a.m. The weight of Ethan's bracers recorded in a column nobody had asked me to keep. I had not written in it since. The whole story was between those pages, even the parts I never recorded. Every contract, Every convoy, every crisis, every person who told me what I was building did not matter, and then watched it save their life. I wrote 2 words at the bottom of the last page: delivery complete. I closed the ledger, finished my drink, and sat with Garrett in the quiet of the depot while the sun went down behind the Capitol.